This is a live look inside the Hennepin County Government Center in downtown Minneapolis, where in just a short time, Judge Peter Cahill will sentence former police officer Derek Chauvin in the murder of George Floyd. Hello, everyone. I am Major Garrett. Thank you for joining us. We are awaiting the sentencing of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Earlier today, the court rejected Chauvin's request for a new trial. A jury, as you might recall, convicted Chauvin in April of killing George Floyd. The panel found Chauvin guilty of unintentional second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Chauvin's charges carry a maximum sentence of up to 40 years in prison. Prosecutors are asking the judge for 3 decades behind bars for Chauvin. The defense attorney is seeking Chauvin's release on probation with credit for time in jail already served. State sentencing guidelines, we should point out, have it somewhere in the middle, with just over a dozen years in prison. Floyd's killing last summer, of course, sparked a wave of protests, not just in Minnesota, here in the United States, but also several other countries around the world. And it ignited a deep and deepening debate here in this country about policing in America. That debate, of course, continues today. CBS News correspondent Jamie Yuccas is with me now in Minneapolis. Jamie, what factors will Judge Cahill weigh in determining Chauvin's sentencing?
Well, Major, there are many layers here that the judge will take under consideration. He's going to go back through all of the testimony of the case. He'll look at all of the evidence of the case, and he'll weigh that. On top of that, prosecutors about a month ago asked about 5 aggravating factors if they could be put in for the judge to consider to up the amount of time that Derek Chauvin could spend in prison. The judge granted 4 of those aggravating factors, and I want to read them to you and get it right. Chauvin, the judge determined Chauvin did abuse a position of trust and authority as an officer, treated Floyd with particular cruelty. Children were present when Floyd was pinned to the pavement at 38th in Chicago, and that he committed the crime with at least 3 other people, which of course are those 3 other officers. The judge has already said that those 4 aggravating factors can play into the sentencing today. What many legal experts have told me is that what you said, the average of that 12.5 years in prison could be upped by almost double. So you're looking at 25 years in prison is what the judge most likely will take a look at. The prosecution has asked for 30 years, as you indicated, and the defense has asked for probation with time served. Now, that with time served factor attached to it, many legal experts have said that was somewhat of a slap in the face for the defense to do that with a community that has been through so much and wanting to see justice served, those protesters asking for that. So the judge has a lot to weigh here, and we've been told that he will probably very likely go one by one through those aggravating factors, be very detailed and specific as to how he came to his sentence. And again, it would be unusual if he went anywhere between 30 and 40 years because Derek Chauvin was convicted on that second-degree unintentional murder charge. If he goes above 30 years, that means Derek Chauvin could potentially serve more time in prison than someone who has been convicted in the state of intentional murder.
And Jamie, it's really important to go through this and remind the audience, when we talked about that state set of guidelines, 12 to 15 years, that only exists, if I understand it correctly, without aggravating circumstances. But with aggravating circumstances, that gives the judge not only discretion, but what the guidelines would say is an imperative to increase the sentence above that average or those underlying guidelines. True?
It is true. It's what we were talking about a little bit ago. But on top of that, Major, what we saw in the trial is that the prosecution was setting up to make sure that the judge knew that they would be asking for those aggravating factors, those 4 factors I just laid out to you, and one of which was the fact that they called children to the witness stand. Darnella Frazier, who has been hailed as the one who put out that video on social media, that first video that the entire world saw as George Floyd was pinned to the ground, she was just 16 at the time when this occurred. She's now 18 years old, but because she was a child, there were other children there. There was Darnella Frazier's niece was there, and she was a minor. So the prosecution called those witnesses in particular because they were minors, knowing that that would be an aggravating factor and something the judge would have to consider. They also, in the prosecution, laid out how it was cruel for Derek Chauvin and tried to say, you know, he just had this blank stare on his face. The prosecution used using that many times to say, look, how cold and cruel that was, that he was a police officer. He could have done many more things to help George Floyd. He had training and that type of thing. So these aggravating factors had been laid out within the prosecution's case. Again, there were 5 in total that the prosecution wanted entered. Just 4 will be considered today. But the judge only has to consider one of those aggravating factors to take the sentence up to nearly double of what that 12.5 years is, so to 25.
So for the audience's benefit, again, Jamie, we have a very wide divergence in requests. You have the defense asking for probation and time served, and the prosecution asking for 30 years. Based on the conversations you've had there with people who are watching this closely and have expertise with this judge and these guidelines, how likely is it that either side will get what it's requested?
I don't think either side is going to get what they requested. I think what the judge is going to do, based on what I've heard within the community and what most community members would be happy with, is if it gets bumped up to at least 20 years. If he does between 20 and 25, there are a number of community activists and leaders who have said, you know what, that would be good enough for us. That would mean that the judge took into consideration these aggravating factors. He got above what's the state requirements, and that would be okay. Many legal experts thinking that that's what's going to happen, which, you know, is far above what the defense is asking for and only slightly below what the prosecution is asking.
And Jamie, at the risk of jumping ahead of things, and we don't want to do that, we want to let the judicial process play itself out, but we should also communicate to the audience that whatever is decided today, there is the option for the defense attorneys representing Derek Chauvin to pursue an appeal. We know today his motion for a new trial was denied. Does he have grounds for an appeal? Do you expect one? Does the community expect one?
I think everyone does expect that he will appeal. His defense attorney, Eric Nelson, made it pretty clear at the end of the trial that they would go ahead and obviously file these motions for a new trial. And if that was not granted, that he would appeal this case. So I think people prepared for that. Many people saying, you know, they don't want that to happen. But I do think the defense is going to go ahead and try to do that. Another interesting thing that happened today is you may recall that once the trial ended, we started hearing from jurors. And there was some discussion about one of the jurors had attended a rally in Washington, D.C. It was argued, was it a Black Lives Matter rally? Did he need to disclose the rally that he went to? And so there's such a thing called a Schwartz hearing that happens here to determine if there was any juror misconduct. The judge also decided today that there had been no juror misconduct and that this trial was fair and that the conviction stands and that there would not be a new trial in this case. However, the one thing we will watch for today is if Derek Chauvin will testify, because many people saying that could potentially hurt him on appeal if he goes ahead and says, I have some guilt in some way. Then his defense attorney is going to have a hard time making a case for an appeal. So if he speaks, what you'll be looking for is language of remorse. It will probably be a very detailed statement that's probably written out by his attorney that sounds remorseful but will not admit any guilt. If for some reason he does admit guilt, even though the defense has said we are going to go ahead and pursue an appeal, that could be grounds to dismiss it. They also have a problem here, the defense does, with the fact that the judge did not see any misconduct with the jury. As you may recall, it took several weeks for this city to be able to sit a jury, one of the most diverse juries this county has ever seen. This county is 80% white, and more than 50% were either black or biracial on that jury. So it's one of those things that they could potentially have a very difficult time getting the same level, and you've had all of this media coverage. So any type of appeal that happens, the defense does have an uphill battle anyway in that case.
Jamie Yuccas, we thank you for all of your coverage and your ongoing assistance as we await the sentencing from Judge Peter Cahill. The country is joining the Floyd family in awaiting today's sentencing. The family lost a beloved father, uncle, and brother in May of 2020. Floyd was just 46-year-old during that fateful encounter with Derek Chauvin. His only alleged crime was using a counterfeit $20 bill. His death sparked a global movement against police brutality, particularly toward black people. Joining me now from Minneapolis is Chris Stewart. He is the co-lead counsel for the Floyd family. Chris, welcome. What can you tell us about the Floyd family's expectations, and maybe the proper word is hopes, as we await the sentencing this afternoon?
That Derek Chauvin will get what the prosecution is asking for, the 30 years, or as close to it as possible. I mean, you know, there have to be repercussions, real repercussions in this situation.
And the repercussions are a guilty verdict. There is a repercussion that's already occurred during the trial where the police chief testified against Derek Chauvin. Those are unusual developments in the long history of American police brutality and police cases. That has to be something the Floyd family has taken on board, and at least it finds at some level satisfying. But the sentencing really does send the ultimate signal, does it not?
It does. You listed two really great things that need to happen in all these situations. Good cops standing up against bad cops, because there are a lot of phenomenal cops out there, but there's too many cops that act like Derek Chauvin. And today they'll learn that there are repercussions for abusing minorities.
And from the Floyd family's perspective and your legal perspective, is there also something larger at stake here, the deterrent effect and the signal to other police departments around the country?
Exactly. I mean, that's all people want is accountability, where if you kill someone unjustly, if you abuse someone just because you're in a bad mood or you're stressed, that you will go to jail, that there are repercussions, that you're not above the law, that good officers and their reputation and their names won't be tarnished by your behavior. We've got to start separating the good from the bad.
And as we await the sentencing and you and the Floyd family think about the future of this conversation in our country, and I hope it is a conversation, not a sort of intense debate where people are finding fault with one side or the other, where do you think the conversation about policing, police reform, federal changes to laws ought to go as we await this sentencing and in the days after that?
When all sides stop screaming at each other and start continuing the conversation, that's when change happens. When people realize that you don't have to be anti-cop to support civil rights, and you don't have to be pro-civil rights and against all policing, that you can be in the middle, that you can fight for what's right. You don't have to pick a side. You don't want minorities abused and killed, and you're not saying every single cop is a crazy killer. It's reality, and it's common sense that we need to embrace more.
And in that embracing of common sense, could I get your reaction, not only legally, but on behalf of the Floyd family, to the defense seeking probation and time served?
Well, that's what they're paid to do.
Mm-hmm. You don't find that offensive. You just find that what a defense attorney would do under this set of circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, he's going to try and zealously fight for his client. I mean, it's ridiculous, but, that's what he's paid to do.
Right. And the judge has the authority, if he so chooses, to go up to 40 years. Do you have any expectation that might happen?
You never know. Justice has really been flowing in this case from the beginning. The only thing we can do is keep praying, because praying has been working so far.
And one last question before I let you go, Chris Stewart. Is it your feeling, and do you have any sense, that if whatever Judge Cahill decides is less than the family wishes or believes is just, it would seek some attempt at remedy or appeal?
I'm not sure. We'd have to cross that bridge when we get there, but, we haven't lost faith in this system yet, in handling of this case, and we won't lose it right now.
Chris Stewart, thank you very much for your time. I very much appreciate it. Legal experts are anticipating the potential precedents, and we talked about them for just a moment, that Chauvin's sentencing could set. Prosecutors, to remind you one more time, asking for 30 years. Chauvin's defense, again reminding you, wants probation and time served. The maximum sentence under Minnesota law, 40 years. We just covered that a little bit. So let's bring in Keir Dougal and Jody Armour. Keir is a CBS News legal contributor and a former federal prosecutor. Jody is a law professor at the University of Southern California's Gould School of Law. Jody, let me start with you, please. Police officers who kill often receive lenient or no punishments. Do you think Derek Chauvin, well, clearly he's going to be an exception to that rule. How much of an exception to that rule do you expect him to be?
Well, this case pits two values against one another. One, holding police accountable, and the other, one of the ones they were arguing for in the streets that were roiling over last summer, systemic racism, addressing systemic racism and moving our criminal justice system away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge, and toward restoration and redemption and rehabilitation. So that new moral framework that new DAs like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, George Gascon here in LA, that new moral framework, if you applied it to Derek Chauvin, would mean that you would not seek the stiffest possible penalty, that you would try to make allowances for human frailty and not view him purely as a monster, that needs to be punished as much as possible, and put in basically solitary confinement, which is what he's going to be probably put in isolation for his own safety, solitary confinement for 23 hours out of a day, 1 hour of exercise. That's hard time. And so this really tests our commitment to this new moral framework that these new progressive prosecutors are coming into office on.
And to continue that conversation, do you think there is any risk here in sentencing overkill, going to 40 years, doing something for an unintentional murder that was not meted out for an intentional murder, even though there is a great sense of wanting some kind of heavy sentence, the book thrown at Derek Chauvin?
Yeah, that's the natural human tendency right now, is to view the amount of punishment you heap on Derek Chauvin as a measure of how much you care about racial justice and about police accountability. And so the more, the better, and that mentality is what got us the new Jim Crow and racialized mass incarceration that we're looking at now in horror after 40 years of that moral framework. And we started to see that maybe not trying to go for the maximum punishment every time, 3 strikes and you're out and all kinds of other enhancements, maybe going another direction is the way we have to go. And actually, in the end of the day, Black folk will especially benefit from a moral framework that's less punitive.
Keir, as you well know, prosecutors want Chauvin to get 30 years. Do you expect Judge Peter Cahill to hand out a sentence of that length or something close to that?
I do. Given that the judge has found the enhancements, I do expect a sentence to be closer to the 2 poles that you discussed earlier, Major, between probation and time served and 30 years. On the other hand, I do expect it to be closer to 30 years than to probation.
And obviously probation is what the defense attorneys are asking for. They're fully within their rights to do that. But clearly, Judge Cahill, by all estimates and conversations that our reporters there on the scene have had, don't expect that to happen. And would you, from your vantage point and history, view something in that 20 to 25 year range as just, and I know you're not the word on it, Judge Cahill's the word on it, but for the larger legal conversation and the set of what this case is and what it represents, would that be something you would regard as just?
So, Major, every judge that I've ever heard speak about the role of sentencing in the things that judges do, every single judge that I've ever heard speak about it has said this is the toughest part of their job, because they're balancing the considerations that Jody mentioned earlier, and a few others. They want to educate people. The role of the criminal law is also to educate. It's to take bad people off the street. The $3 lawyer word for that is called sequestration. There is also this notion of rehabilitation. There are rule of law issues, and there are just straightforward punishment issues. And a lot of these policy concerns they don't all cut in the same direction. So for Mr. Chauvin, this is a brutal crime. The top count is a felony murder count. You've discussed the aggravating factors. And I think to reconcile these different policy concerns as a judge, in my view, you're going to end up 20 years or more. I would be surprised if the judge gave Mr. Chauvin the maximum theoretical sentence of 40 years, but I would expect a sentence between 20 and 30 years unless we see some surprise at the sentencing hearing.
Jody, I want to ask you this. The nation has not heard from Derek Chauvin in the course of this proceeding. He cited his Fifth Amendment rights in the trial. Do you have any expectation that you or the rest of the nation will hear from him today? And if so, what might that be?
You could probably only heard him. He has a federal trial that's looming, and he doesn't want to say anything that's going to harm him there. it would certainly help to humanize what many view as merely a monster, right? He has been monsterized, and I'm not saying that what we all saw there doesn't turn your gut and make you sick to your stomach, but it can also turn him into a cardboard villain and make it much easier to heap all this kind of retribution untempered by any compassion for human frailty at all. But I don't think he will, even though I think it would help if he did.
From that
it wouldn't help with this judge, by the way. I think the judge is going to have his mind made up, but it would help in the court of public opinion, if you will.
Right. And Jody, from that perspective, this is not the only case in which a white police officer has acted unjustly against an unarmed black person in this country, but it has taken on, I don't need to tell you, and our audience knows this deeply, a super large metaphorical importance, literal and metaphorical importance. How do you think what we see today and the ongoing legal drama that will flow from it will inform and influence the ongoing conversation this country has had and will have that is new as a result of the George Floyd killing?
Yeah, that's really the question, Major. Will this be viewed as the system correcting itself? Look, the system can take care of its own bad apple. Some will characterize this as. And if you view it that way, then that might be a prescription for, not taking much action, not for apathy. Versus this is the first time that we've seen an officer, held criminally liable for on-duty killing like this in a long time. We've seen other cases like Rodney King, when we had the videotaped evidence, he was acquitted by the First Simi Valley jury. When Walter Scott, we had a video of him being shot 6 times in the back, and the first jury deadlocked on that. So this is a very low bar. If it takes a 9-minute and 29-second video to get a conviction against an officer, that's not sending much of a deterrent signal out to other officers. They just don't go that extreme, seems to could arguably be the message. But certainly, Major, what this has done has created a national conversation. And beyond that, the marches in the street have resulted in change. Here in L.A., we got a new DA, George Gascon, as progressive prosecutor, ousting a traditional law and order one, a Measure J, which is kind of defund the police, 10% of the county budget, going to incarceration alternative. So it has had a big impact on our national consciousness and discussion, although I don't think it'll send much of a deterrent signal out to police officers.
Keir, I'd like your thoughts on that. You're a former federal prosecutor. How do you believe, and in what specific ways do you believe, the conversation within judicial circles has been A, influenced, and B, changed by everything that we've seen since May of last year in the George Floyd case?
Well, I hope there are conversations about trying to deconflict encounters between law enforcement and citizenry over these, very low importance, sort of low priority crimes. We've seen a lot of these conflicts between law enforcement officers over routine traffic stops, over an alleged $20 counterfeit bill. These are conflicts that I hope there is discussion in police departments and law enforcement to deconflict these encounters. And I agree with Jody. A New York Times study that I read around the time of the George Floyd events last year said that only about 1% of brutality issues were charged, and something like less than 0.5% of them ever resulted in conviction. I think that is a very low deterrent, and I think that perhaps with the technology, with a lot of cell phone cameras, with more police departments adopting body cameras, and with more scrutiny, the deterrent will become stronger. It's hard to know, certainly in advance of this sentence, but even after the sentence, assuming that my prediction is correct, the sentence will be substantial, whether that will act as a real deterrent. It certainly sets as at least one data point, if Mr. Chauvin is sentenced to something like 20 years, that the consequences here really can be serious for the few officers who are the bad apples. I think most of them, in my experience, most officers aren't bad apples. But I also hope that we see, as you mentioned, Major, the police chief explaining to the jury why what Chauvin did was incorrect. I hope we pierce the blue wall of silence a little bit and get officers who are willing to say, no, what they saw their fellow officer do was not appropriate. I hope all of those things happen in the aggregate and that we do see a change.
Jody Armour and Keir McDougall, thank you very much for your time. Today's sentencing could be just the second time in Minnesota history that a police officer is in prison for an on-duty killing. I want to bring in Kevin Powell. He's an activist, journalist, and original cast member of The Real World New York. Kevin, it's good to have you with us. How much do you feel is riding on this sentencing, and do you think there is a certain level of punishment that feels appropriate in this particular case?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. This sentence is not just about Derek Chauvin, but this is about the folks who've gotten away, sadly, with murdering Black people for many, many years. And so that's why there was such an outpouring of jubilation, not because of Derek Chauvin, but because we never see this happen in any way. We remember Rodney King, we remember many of the cases. And I want to respectfully disagree with your previous guest. Unfortunately, what we're talking about is a culture of violence within the police department that has makes it okay to do this and get away with it. Derek Chauvin just happens to be someone who was convicted of it. I was beaten by a police officer when I was 15 years old. Doesn't mean that we think that all police officers are bad, but we got to be honest about the fact that there's a culture in place that says that it's okay to harm poor people, working class people, Black and brown people in this country if you happen to have a badge. And that's what happened to George Floyd. That's just the most egregious example that we've seen because it was videotaped for 9 minutes, 29 seconds. But this has been going on for decades upon decades.
And Kevin, that goes to this question of what is compliance, what is non-compliance, and what are the police empowered to do when they encounter what they regard as non-compliance. True?
Well, if we look at the videotape of George Floyd, how could he not be complying when he was face down on the ground, handcuffed behind his back, screaming for his mother as he was dying? And so, you know, there's a whole range of things that we need to talk about, which is how do we police our communities in the first place? Why is violence a solution for everything? Are police officers equipped to deal with things like domestic violence, domestic disputes, mental health issues? And I respectfully say that should not be the job of a police officer. And when we see a lot of the cases that have happened, we've even seen disabled people killed or shot by the police because they didn't know how to relate to that particular part of the community. So it's not just about compliance, non-compliance. It's like, how are police officers trained and what are they actually prepared to deal with and what are they not prepared to deal with? That's the real question to me.
Right, and I brought that up, Kevin, not to be a mouthpiece for the Minneapolis Police Department, but to remember that it was brought up in the trial that was a justification for what Derek Chauvin did, that he was non-compliant. And the jury listened to that and rejected that. In the tortured arc of American justice, how important do you think that is or isn't?
I tell you, of course they're going to bring it up. They're going to bring up a whole bunch of things. I paid attention very closely to the trial. The man was face down, handcuffs behind his back. There was no issue of compliance or non-compliance. There was nothing he could do. There was nothing. This was, in my opinion, a willful act. You see Derek Chauvin's face. He's unemotional as this man is screaming for his mother, and he literally took the man's life by kneeing him to death. And the hope is of myself and other folks who are leaders, activists around the country, is that this gentleman will get the maximum penalty today because it sends a message not just to Derek Chauvin but to police officers and anyone who does this, any kind of racial murder, that this is unacceptable, that our lives are valuable and we need to stop killing people just because of who they are, because we think that they did something that is so egregious that they deserve to have their lives taken. That's unacceptable. That's inhumane, and that's not who we should be as American people.
Kevin, I want to bring into the conversation Lorenzo Boyd. He is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of New Haven. Lorenzo, as someone who works with the police department, what impact, if any, do you see the Chauvin case having had or having in the future?
I think the guilty verdict on all counts was the best possible outcome for policing because it shows good police officers that they can distance themselves from the stuff that happened with Chauvin. And there's no excusing what happened. So we're hoping that the verdict is also going to give a sentence that actually sends a message to all bad cops that are out there.
And Lorenzo, do you think, based on your interactions with police departments, there is a different conversation about tactics, about terminology, what is compliance, what is non-compliance? How do you de-escalate situations? How do you find ways to mediate situations that are less aggressive than the kind of tactics that either Derek Chauvin used or other officers have used that have had deadly consequences with their own service firearms?
Well, two things I want to mention to you, Major. Yes, it absolutely changed the conversation. And I think the Derek Chauvin video worked its way into every training of every police department, or at least every progressive department around the country. But more importantly, it talks about what happens prior to the fact that people get together, what happens before the initial contact. It talks a lot about building relationships in the community. It talks about how do we avoid getting to this point.
Let me jump in, Lorenzo, because I need to get to the courtroom because Peter Cahill is there. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. And Kevin, the judge is now opening the proceeding.
And for the defense.
Good afternoon, Your Honor. Eric Nelson and Amy Voss appearing on behalf of Mr. Chauvin.
Thank you. We are still, for all those attending, under somewhat modified COVID restrictions, so we are asking that everyone keep their masks on unless they are speaking. I'll ask for people who are speaking to come up to the lectern and use the microphones, and please to remove your mask so that we can hear you clearly, and also to maintain the distances that we have set out in the courtroom. With that, we'll proceed first with the state. Mr. Blackwell, you may proceed with victim input.
Your Honor, we have 4 victim impact statements. We will start with the 7-year-old daughter of George Floyd, Gianna Floyd, who will present hers by video.
What do you miss most about your daddy?
Well, I ask about him all the time. And that's kind of it.
Yeah. Well, when you ask about him, what are you asking about?
Well, I was asking, how did my dad get hurt?
Do you wish that he was still here with us?
Yeah, but he is.
Through his spirit?
Yes.
Yes. And when you see your daddy again one day, what do you want to do when you see him?
I want to play with him.
What kind of games do you want to play with him?
I want to play with him, have fun, go on a plane ride, and that's it.
Yeah.
We used to have dinner meals every single night before we went to bed. My daddy always used to help me brush my teeth.
Oh. Do you miss him helping brush your teeth?
Yes.
How do you hope that the world remembers him?
Well, they help him because those mean people did something to him.
Yeah. If you could say anything to your daddy right now, what would it be?
It would be, I miss you and I love you.
All right. Thank you, Gianna. I really appreciate you answering questions today.
That was Gianna Floyd. Your Honor, next we'll hear from the nephew of George Floyd, Brandon Williams. Mr. Williams.
If you could begin by giving us your full name and spelling each of your names.
Brandon Williams, Brandon Williams.
Thank you. You may proceed.
On Monday, May 25th, 2020, George Perry Floyd Jr. was murdered by Derek Chauvin in a malicious and insidious display of hate and abuse of power. Chauvin killed George. Not only did he kill George, but he also displayed a total lack of consideration for human life as he did so. You saw it, I saw it, and millions of people across this country and the globe witnessed the act of hate. A year and 1 month later, I stand there before you tasked with the duty of expressing how George's death has impacted me personally and the rest of our family. As I racked my brain and thought about what I could say today, I came to this conclusion. It is humanly impossible for me to stand here and convey or articulate the right words that would capture all that we are feeling and what we have felt over this period. So please bear with me as I attempt the impossible. The sudden murder of George has forever traumatized us. You may see us cry, but the full extent of our pain and trauma will never be seen with the naked eye. The heartbreak and hurt goes far beyond any number of tears we could ever cry. Words simply cannot express the pain, anguish, and suffering that our family and friends have endured since George's murder. It has been truly unimaginable, but not as nearly unimaginable as the defendant's decision to take the life of a human being with no regard for the effect it may have on others. Although Chauvin will be sentenced today and spend time in prison, he will have the luxury of seeing his family again, talking to them, and he will likely get to spend time with them upon his release. These are all luxuries that my young cousin Gianna was robbed of when Chauvin made the active decision to kill her father. There will be no more birthday parties, no graduations, holiday gatherings, or other family celebrations. The laughter, hugs, guidance, advice, sense of security, and those opportunities to simply say I love you are forever gone. They say time heals all, and while I generally believe that saying, it's challenging to do so given these unfathomable set of circumstances. Before I conclude, I must highlight a few things. George's murder, this trial, and everything in between has been tragic and devastating. Our family is forever broken, and one thing we cannot get back is George Floyd. It is the request of my family that the maximum penalty for the crime for which the defendant was convicted be imposed. On behalf of my family, friends, community, and supporters, I wish to express my sincerest gratitude for allowing us opportunities of expression. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, first, just for the record, this wonderful lady standing here is a Hennepin County victim advocate.
Ms. Boswell is well known to the court.
Yes, thank you, Judge.
And so, Your Honor, we'll next hear from the brother of George Floyd, Mr. Terrence Floyd.
And Mr. Floyd, if you could state your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes. Terrence Floyd. That's Terrence, Floyd, Floyd.
Go ahead.
I'm here representing my brother. I'm from New York. On May 25th, 2020, my brother was murdered, everyone knows, by Derek Chauvin. The facts of this case were proven beyond a reasonable doubt, and 3 guilty verdicts have been rendered. This situation has really affected me and my family. Any family member that has went through this, we are part of a fraternity of families, and it's not one of those, fraternities that you enjoy. I just, over this last year and months, I actually talked to a few people, and I wanted to know from the man himself
Why? What were you thinking? What was going through your head when you had your knee on my brother's neck? Why, when you knew that he posed no threat anymore, he was handcuffed, why you didn't at least get up? Why you stayed there? A month before my brother was murdered, I was on the phone with him, and we had a long conversation. And as I looked at the video of my niece, the last conversation me and my brother had was he wanted to have play dates. He wanted to plan play dates with Gianna and my daughter. And we started setting it up. That can't happen. And I have to, my daughter's still young, but I still have to explain to her because this is history. This is a case everybody knows about. So she's gonna find out, and I'm gonna have to explain that to her. And I think that's, to me, harder than even just standing here, that I have to talk to my daughter and tell her, you know, about her niece, about her uncle, about the situation. That's basically reliving it all over again, years down the line. I'm here on behalf of my family, on behalf of me and my family, we seek the maximum penalty. We don't want to see no more slaps on the wrists. We've been through that already. In my community, in my culture, we've been through that already. Smacked on the wrist. No. Because if it was us, if the roles was reversed, there wouldn't be no case. It would have been open and shut. We'd have been under the jail for murdering somebody. So we asked for that same penalty for Derek Chauvin. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Your Honor, the final victim impact statement for the state will come from George Floyd's brother, Phalonis Floyd.
And sir, if you could begin by giving us your full name and spell each of your names, and I have permitted you to use your phone because you have notes on it, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right, and you may proceed when you're ready. Giving us your full name first.
Phalonis Floyd, spelled P-H-I-L-O-N-I-S-E, last name Floyd, F-L-O-I-D.
And you may proceed.
One year ago, May 25th, my brother George was murdered by Derek Chauvin and his co-defendants in broad daylight with a knee to his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. I was a trucker, and immediately my life changed forever. I began to speak to the world for George from the United Nations, Africa, Canada, Japan, and so many other countries. Every day, I have begged for justice to be served, reliving the execution of George, while others begged and pleaded for Officer Chauvin to simply just allow George to take a breath. I haven't had a real nice sleep because of the nightmares I constantly have hearing my brother beg and plead for his life over and over again. Even saying they're going to kill me. Please, officer. Screaming for our mom. I have had to sit through each day of Officer Derek Chauvin's trial and watch the video of George dying for hours over and over again. For an entire year, I had to relive George being tortured to death every hour of the day, only taking naps and not knowing what a good night's sleep is anymore. I've been lifting my voice tirelessly every day so that George's death will not be in vain. Honorable Judge Peter Cahill, I thank you for allowing me to share this today. George's life mattered. So my family and I, most of all, my niece, Gianna. My niece, Gianna, she needs closure. I'm asking that you please find it suitable to give Officer Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, charge that he has been found guilty for. My family and I have been given a life sentence. We will never be able to get George back. Daddy's our daughter's first love. He would never be able to walk Gianna down the aisle at her wedding, attend those magical moments of her life like a daddy-daughter dance, sweet 16 party, seeing her out for prom graduations, and she would never be able to have any personal memories with her father. With a smirk on his face and children present, Officer Chauvin used excessive force and acted against his training. Chauvin had no regards for human life, George's life. I stand before you today asking you to please help us find closure by giving Chauvin the maximum sentence possible, making sure he does his time consecutively without the possibilities of parole, probation, or getting out early for good behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Frank.
Thank you, Your Honor. Here today, of course, for sentencing, gives us an opportunity to speak about other matters that I think are involved in sentencing and where we are in the criminal justice system in the processing of this case. As a member of an elected office representing the people of the state of Minnesota, as well as people of the local community, I want to say a couple of things. And first of all, I want to really thank some of the police officers in the Minneapolis Police Department who, under great pressure, great stress, and to some extent at peril to their occupations, what they've devoted their life to, stuck to their oath and their commitment as police officers to speak openly and honestly about policing and the training that is given and received by police officers. Those officers didn't hide behind a blue wall. They came forward, they told this court and those jurors what they knew about training and responsibility, and I think they deserve recognition and credit for that. I would also like to thank members of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. Those agents get called in, great sacrifice to their personal lives. Whenever things happen, they go. They did that here, and under really extraordinary circumstances, completed a very professional and thorough investigation. Conducting interviews is hard enough, but conducting them in the atmosphere of the city following the murder of George Floyd was even more difficult. And they did so, I think, above and beyond the call of duty And I want to thank them for doing that on behalf of the whole prosecution staff. Your Honor, I want to thank the family, the loved ones, the friends of George Floyd. They have been through so much more than families involved in murder cases. He's right. It's a fraternity you don't want to be part of. But they've been through so much more because of the pandemic and because of security, safety precautions that we've had to take. They have been through a lot. At a time when they try to grieve, like everybody does for the loss of someone, they are going through so much more. And I want to thank them, all of them, the family. The court saw a testimony from Philonise Floyd, Courtney Ross. These are people who are trying to deal with their loss, but they have to do it in a very public way and under very trying circumstances through no fault of their own. So I thank them. They have all been models of grace and understanding. And it's really remarkable, quite frankly. I'll, I think, come back to them again in a little bit. Your Honor, we have submitted a sentencing brief. I would incorporate that. I guess I would incorporate my comments today into that memo. But I do think there are things that I want to bring out today in my arguments. For hundreds of years, the court had discretion in sentencing. It was the trial court's decision on what a sentence should be. The recognition that the trial court sat through the trial, watched the evidence, and saw how it affected people, informed the court's discretion. When the legislature passed the guidelines, in a legitimate attempt to try and even out sentences, they defined certain presumptive sentences, as we all know, for typical crimes. For each crime, the typical crime. But they did not remove discretion for sentencing judges. They recognized that nobody is better suited to decide whether this is the typical case represented by that guidelines presumptive sentence, or if there are reasons why this is worse than that. And it gave, and the guideline still gives this court discretion when there are aggravating factors to give a more serious sentence than what the guidelines presumption calls for. And as you know, we are asking you to do that today. As this court found, there are 4 aggravating factors that we have identified. They go beyond a list of just what those factors are. We have not just done our homework and found a list. The court made good findings, detailed findings about those factors, and we think they justify a greatly increased sentence. This is not the typical second-degree unintentional murder. Supreme Court in our state has said that, and very recently, even 1 aggravating factor is sufficient to go twice the top of the range. Here we have 4. The first one that the court found is an abusive position of trust and authority. And the court specifically found that when Mr. Chauvin was acting as a police officer, he had a position of trust and authority. That is certainly true. We trust police officers. We trust them when we need help. We call them for help. We trust that they're going to take care of the problems that they are assigned to deal with, right? We trust them. We also give them great authority. We give them great power. We give them power to use force that individuals would be prosecuted for using, right? We give them authority to arrest, to detain. And with great power, of course, comes great responsibility. So they're not sent out there by themselves to do this. They're given substantial training. This court saw all of that through the trial, in general and in specific to Mr. Chauvin and the other 3 officers. They're given training on the use of force, the proportional use of force. The force used has to be warranted by the threat. They're given training on de-escalation because we recognize that police officers are called in when people are not having their best day, when people might be affected by mental illness, drug abuse, any number of issues. They're just having a bad day, and they're trained for that and should be. And they're taught how to use that to de-escalate and control a situation. They're taught medical intervention. They're taught to provide medical attention to people who need it. Being a police officer is a difficult job. We ask a lot of them. It's a profession, there's no doubt about it. But we give them a substantial amount of training, and most officers do it right. This case wasn't about police officers, all police officers. It wasn't about policing. This case was about Derek Chauvin disregarding all that training he received and assaulting Mr. Floyd until he suffocated to death. One of the things that you heard, Your Honor, and the jurors heard that can really encapsulate, I think, a very important issue here. 7 words: in your custody is in your care. And it's a real simple mantra. It's a real easy thing to remember. You're going to take custody of somebody, you have to provide care. You have to do it in a caring way. You can't simply disregard their care. Mr. Chauvin abused his position of trust and authority as a police officer by doing just that, just disregarding all his training. It was an abuse of that because what did he decide to do? We often are forced in this, criminal justice system to infer people's state of mind by their conduct and their statements. What was Derek Chauvin's end game here? What was the plan? It seems apparent the plan was hold him down until we can dump him in an ambulance and no longer have him be our problem. You recall he said to Charles McMillan, "He's a big guy, might be on something." That's it. He held Mr. Floyd down as Mr. Floyd begged for his life. He had the other officers help in that regard. And rather than doing the simple expedient of putting him on his side, he said, "Yeah, He was dismissive to that duty of care. We trust that arrestees will be treated with respect, reasonable force, and that their medical needs will be addressed." I'm paraphrasing from the court's findings. That trust was violated. We trust that they will use their authority reasonably, and this was a particularly egregious abuse of that force. Again, paraphrasing the court's findings. The typical second-degree murder does not involve that extent of abuse of a dearly held position of abuse or a position of authority and trust by the community, by individuals of the community. Your Honor found that Mr. Floyd was treated by Mr. Chauvin with particular cruelty. I think tortured is the right word. We know that, we've all seen it. Mr. Floyd did not want to be in the back seat. That's it. That's the rub. It was the need to get him in that back seat no matter what. And we all saw that once he was pulled out of that back seat, he calmed right down, even willingly went down to the ground. "I'm going down," he said. And he went down to the ground, not fighting, not punching, and he was placed initially on his side. He's already handcuffed. He's placed on his side in the recovery position, like he should be, because he's trying to breathe, and then quickly placed prone on the ground, face down. Mr. Chauvin put his left knee on George Floyd's neck, his right knee on George Floyd's back, face down on the pavement. Had Officer King sit on Mr. Floyd's waist area, and had Officer Lane hold his feet down. You can even see Mr. Floyd trying to pull his feet up. We all are going to fight to breathe. Everybody knows that fear when you all of a sudden realize you're having trouble breathing. It's just innate, right? We want to survive. We know we have to breathe. And there's an automatic reaction when you begin to feel like that is threatened. And you can see Mr. Floyd going through that. He tries to pull his feet up. But he's held down by these 3 officers while Officer Tao is looking on. Later, of course, goes to keep the people who want to help away. He's placed face down on this pavement so harshly that it rubs the skin off his face. He has injuries to his face from being face down on that pavement. He has injuries to his knuckles from just trying to lift himself up. And he's telling Officer Chauvin, "I can't breathe. I'm dying." And Mr. Chauvin's response was, And all this time, I mean, imagine what Mr. Floyd is going through. If we're going to talk about particular cruelty and torture, really try to appreciate what he's going through. He knows he's suffocating. We all know that feeling of not being able to breathe enough. And he's begging, he's pleading, and he's being ignored. His concerns are being dismissed by somebody who has taken custody but not care. He was kept in that prone position for 9.5 minutes and was suffocated. There's no other way to say it. That's particularly cruel. That is more cruel than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. Significantly more. This is not a momentary gunshot, punch to the face. This is 9.5 minutes of cruelty to a man who was helpless and just begging for his life. This court found that there were children present, standing only a few feet from these officers. These children, who were ages 17 and one child age 9. Why is that an aggravating factor? Well, I think everybody can figure that out. Right? It's particularly bad to commit a crime in front of children. We've heard a lot of academia about the development of the young brain and how long it can take. And here you got a couple of teenage girls and a 9-year-old girl. How are they going to process this? Standing feet from a man being suffocated by police officers. Such a stark sight that one of the children even says, "We got to call the police on the police." How do you process that as a 9-year-old? The children were not only present watching a man die. We've all seen, if you haven't, you really need to. Look at George Floyd's face. As he's dying, he's suffering. The children have to watch this. But not only that, it's police officers, and there are people around them wanting to help. And at one point, and sure, they got upset. And at one point, Mr. Chauvin points his mace, grabs his mace to keep him back. How does a child look at that? There's another officer screaming at them to get back. The typical second-degree unintentional murder doesn't involve children standing feet away watching a 9.5-minute suffocation of a man begging for his life. This court also made a finding that the defendant committed the offense with the involvement of 3 or more other persons. Lane and King were involved directly in the restraint, and that Tao kept the bystanders at bay. I've already talked a little bit about Lane and King's role in holding Mr. Floyd down. They recognized that he was pulseless, that Mr. Floyd was pulseless at one point, and yet really made no effort to take care of the person in their custody Officer Tao watched most of the suffocation and then only went over to keep people from giving help. One person who is identified as a medical trained firefighter for the city of Minneapolis, and that was dismissed. Like, are we going to believe her? So they kept trained medical people from providing help. These were all uniformed peace officers, adding to that abuse of trust and authority. You know, I know the defense has asked the court for probation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time arguing that. It's so outside of the realm of, I think, real possibility. This is a murder. I understand some of the arguments made on behalf of Mr. Chauvin. I understand, well, no, I can't understand what his family members and friends are going through. I can't. But it's certainly not enough for a departure to probation for a second-degree murder. We believe, Your Honor, that these 4 aggravating factors and the findings that the court has made certainly justify an upward departure because there are 4 of them, not standing alone, but in a sense, not overlapping, but coming together to show this is not the typical second-degree murder. This is egregious. And this justifies a double upward departure. From the top of the box, which is 180 months, we're asking the court to do a double departure, recognizing all 4 factors, to 360 months. As I mentioned before, Your Honor, this is sentencing. This is the time for victims, right? This is the time for the loved ones of the victim and the community to have a say. Again, I commend this family. I commend all of the loved ones, the friends, the people that have been involved in this case for tolerating and being gracious. None of this, of course, can bring George Floyd back. That's very true. But this is the time for our criminal justice system to say, we hear you. This is the time for their criminal justice system to say, we recognize that this harm you're going through is real, and while we can't feel what you're feeling, we know we can do what your criminal justice system should do and recognize the severity of this crime and reflect that in the sentence to be given. It's time for this criminal justice system to say, we recognize this is more serious than the typical second-degree unintentional murder. The 4 reasons the court found reflect that and give this court more than an adequate basis to do that. Your Honor, we ask the court to impose a sentence of 360 months, commitment to the Commissioner of Corrections. As you know, Your Honor, there are no fines in murder cases. And we would ask the court just to reserve the issue of restitution. So we can clarify that with the family and present that to the court for 30 days. Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Nelson. I'm sorry. Mr. Blackwell?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, just thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, at this time, the defendant's mother, Carolyn Palenti, would like to address the court.
If you could state your full name, spelling each of your names, and proceed when you're ready.
Carolyn, C-A-R-O-L-Y-N, Palenti, P-A-W-L-E-N-T-Y. I am the mother of Derek Chauvin. I am here to speak on behalf of my entire family. On November 25th, 2020, not only did Derek's life change forever, but so did mine and my family's. Derek devoted 19 years of his life to the Minneapolis Police Department. It has been difficult for me to hear and read what the media, public, and prosecution team believe Derek to be an aggressive, heartless, and uncaring person. I can tell you that is far from the truth. My son's identity has also been reduced to that as a racist. I want this court to know that none of these things are true and that my son is a good man. Derek always dedicated his life and time to the police department. Even on his days off, he would call in to see if they needed help. Derek is a quiet, thoughtful, honorable, and selfless man. He has a big heart, and he always has put others before his own. The public will never know the loving and caring man he is, but his family does. Even though I have not spoken publicly, I have always supported him 100% and always will. Derek has played over and over in his head the events of that day. I've seen the toll it has taken on him. I believe a lengthy sentence will not serve Derek well. When you sentence my son, you will also be sentencing me. I will not be able to see Derek, talk to him on the phone, or give him our special hug. Plus the fact that when he is released, his father and I most likely will not be here. Derek, my happiest moment is when I gave birth to you. And my second is when I was honored to pin your police badge on you. I remember you whispering to me, "Don't stick me with it." Derek, I want you to know I have always believed in your innocence, and I will never waver from that. I have read numerous letters from people around the world that also believe in your innocence. No matter where you go, where you are, I will always be there to visit you. I promise you I will stay strong, as we talked about, and I want you to do the same for me. I will do what you told me to do, take care of myself, so I will be here for you when you come home. Remember, there is no stronger bond or love than a mother's love. One final thought I want you to remember. Remember, you are my favorite son. Thank you for your time.
Mr. Nelson.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. It is my intent that my remarks this afternoon be quite brief.
I do not intend to relitigate the facts of this case, nor spend any substantial time looking at the law. The court is very familiar with the facts of this case, and the parties have fully briefed the court relevant to the sentencing factors. And we recognize that in any case, any sentencing that comes before the court is tasked with a difficult job. The court must craft a sentence that serves the interests of justice, a rather nebulous term. The court must take into consideration the victim impact, public interest, as well as the circumstances and the history of the defendant. And in this case, more than any other that likely any of us have ever been involved in, that task is exceedingly more difficult. In my remarks today, I just wish to briefly address each of those three considerations, starting with the public impact. As I believe we are all cognizant of, this case is at the epicenter of a cultural and political divide. We tried to keep a lot of that out of the courtroom during the trial and make this case about the facts. But we recognize what has happened as a result of this case. There are a great number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as overly lenient and insufficient to satisfy justice. But there are an equal number of people who will view any sentence you pronounce as draconian or overbearing. Either way, some percentage of the public will view your sentence as a miscarriage of justice. The intensity of the public interest in this case cannot be understated. I trust that the volume of correspondence that each of us has received from the public at large is indicative of these very sentiments on both sides. As I was informed just yesterday, the Attorney General's office established a website, web submission, to accept community impact statements. Again, in my understanding is in a little over 2 weeks, they received over 1,000 submissions. Again, on both sides. By my very best estimate, since my representation of Mr. Chauvin began last summer, I would estimate that I have received over 5,000 emails, over 1,000 voicemails, and hundreds of handwritten letters. Again, from both sides. And I expect that Your Honor has likewise been inundated with public comment and scrutiny. The impact that this case has had on this community is profound. It goes far beyond what happened on May 25th of last year. It has been at the forefront of our national consciousness, and it has weaved its way into nearly every facet of our lives, from the entertainment that we consume to the presidential politics, from protests to conspiracy theories. In the end, it is my sincere hope that when this proverbial dust settles, the community impact brings forth principled debate and civil public discourse, and ultimately leaves a positive effect on the city of Minneapolis, the state of Minnesota, and the United States. But nevertheless, while this court may consider the community impact, it is for these very same reasons that the court must turn to the foundational legal principles and remember that justice is blind. Law is built on reason and common sense, and it cannot be permitted to be assailed by public opinion. Turning to the second consideration, which is the victim impact, the death of George Floyd. The death of George Floyd was tragic. He is loved by his family members. He is loved by his friends. And his death is justifiably mourned by those whose lives he impacted. He is a son, a brother, a father, an uncle, and a friend to many. And as the court heard today, the impact and the loss of his life, simply just, it can't be simplified. And it will take time. Finally, Your Honor, the court must take into consideration, just like it has to take into consideration the aggravating factors, it needs to take into consideration the mitigating factors. And the mitigating factors as set forth by the sentencing guidelines really point to the TROG analysis, essentially, ultimately in this case. We're not going to spend a lot of time, again, arguing for a probationary sentence. That's briefed. But that being said, when we look at the TROG factors, who is Derek Chauvin? Derek Chauvin spent 19 years as a Minneapolis police officer. He loved being a police officer. I was contacted during the course of my representation and have had numerous conversations with his fellow police officers or fellow police officers that worked with Derek, some retired, some still active. And they told me that he was a solid police officer, that he did his job, that if somebody asked him to do a particular task, he never complained, he did it. One person told me that one of his sergeants told me that if I had asked him to dig a ditch for 8 hours, he would have picked up a shovel and he would have never complained for a second. He would have done his job. He was decorated as a police officer, multiple life-saving awards. He was decorated for valor. He was proud to be a police officer because what he liked to do was help people. And as the statistics show, the vast majority of police work is helping people. He was proud to be a Minneapolis police officer. He served his country as the United States in the United States Army. And he too is a son, and a brother, and a father, and a friend. He too, his life, the life he's lived, he's not coming into this as a career criminal with 6 points, 5 points, 4 points. He's coming into this never having violated the law because he lived an honorable life and he attempted to live an honorable life. Derek Chauvin was not even scheduled to work on May 25th, 2020. He volunteered because there was short staffing at the time. I know from numerous conversations that I've had with Derek that his brain is littered with what ifs. What if I just had not agreed to go in that day? What if things had gone differently? What if I never responded to that call? What if, what if, what if? The truth of the matter is, and the end result is that we are here after a jury verdict, finding him guilty of these offenses. And the court's consideration should not only be focused on the aggravating factors, but the mitigating factors as well. The Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission was established for a reason. And yes, the court in circumstances like these has discretion to go beyond and aggravate a sentence beyond the presumptive sentences established by the sentencing guidelines. But the sentencing guidelines don't differentiate between second-degree murders. Someone robs a liquor store, a police officer is involved in an incident, and a person dies in police custody. The law presumes, the legislature presumes, that the sentencing guidelines as established is a sufficient penalty for all of the second-degree murder categories or cases you would see. From 2019 back to 2010, a total of 90 people were sentenced for second-degree murder. Those sentences, those people, there were more than that, but people who had a 0 criminal history score. More than 90 people were sentenced. 67%, or 60 of those 90 people, received a guideline sentence of 150 months. So 2/3 of all people in this same position received a guideline sentence. 20% received an aggravated sentence, 18 of the 90, and 13%, or 12 individuals, were granted mitigated departures. So if the legislature and the intent of the sentencing guidelines is to eliminate sentencing disparity, the law should presume that the guideline sentence is what is appropriate in this case. Judge may take into consideration at this point those aggravating factors, but you have to counterbalance them, which is the goal of the law, with the mitigating factors. I know that this has been an incredibly difficult case for the Floyd family to have to endure. The state of Minnesota, likewise, the prosecutors in this case have endured quite a bit, as has Mr. Chauvin's family. This is a case that has changed the world to some degree, and I hope it's positive. But it's my hope that the court follows the sentencing guidelines, applies the law in a reasoned manner, and imposes a just sentence.
Thanks, Mr. Chauvin. Would you join Mr. Nelson at the lectern? Mr. Chauvin, this is your opportunity if you wish to give any input to the court. And so I turn it over to you and your attorney.
Thank you, Your Honor. At this time, due to some additional legal matters at hand, I'm not able to give a full formal statement at this time. But very briefly, though, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
And I'll note that I did read your comments in the pre-sentence investigation as well.
Thanks, Ron.
All right, we are going to take a 15-minute recess so that I can complete the sentencing order based on what I've heard today. And let's reconvene at 2:45. We're in recess.
Peter Cahill ordering a recess in the proceedings that will lead to the sentencing of Derek Chauvin, the former Minneapolis Police Department officer convicted of second-degree murder in the death last May 25th, 2020, of George Floyd. Court is now obviously in recess. What we heard is victim impact statements, not only from the Floyd family, but we also heard from Derek Chauvin's mother, and we heard from lawyers on both sides. Judge Cahill will hand down Derek Chauvin's sentence when court resumes, and he said 2:45 p.m., that would be Minneapolis time. Let us bring in Keir Dougal, Jody Armour, and Lorenzo Boyd. Keir is a CBS News legal contributor, former federal prosecutor. Jody is a law professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Lorenzo is vice president for diversity and inclusion and the chief diversity officer at the University of New Haven. Keir, what do you make of the family's impact statements and what we've seen so far in this proceeding?
Right. One of the things that you often hear at sentencing and submissions on behalf of the defendant are comments about the effect on the family. And my general impression is that they do not, the family of the defendant. And my general impression is that they do not do a lot to move a judge, because the judge is going to simply say, well, the cause of this, these issues, the cause of the separation between you as defendant and your family is you. It was your conduct that, in committing the crimes that the jury found you guilty of, that in fact is going to cause the disruption in Mr. Chauvin's family. The other The other thing that struck me about the hearing was the description of his conduct as torture, and a description of the charged crime as unintentional murder. That struck me as discordant. And the crime that he was charged with, or the top count that he was convicted on, is often described as a felony murder charge, where the intent to commit another crime becomes the basis when the result is a homicide of a murder 2 charge. So although the prosecution here wasn't required to prove Mr. Chauvin's intent to kill, what that charge represented was proof that he intended to commit a different crime, a different felony, an assault that resulted in a murder. So I as a way of explaining this discordant set of discussions about an unintentional murder as defined under the law and torture, I think that's the way to resolve it, but that struck me about the hearing.
Jody, I want to ask you, Matthew Frank, the prosecutor, said that Derek Chauvin ignored his training, acted with, quote-unquote, particular cruelty, and that George Floyd knew he was suffocating. That's why he was resisting on the ground. The defense attorney, Eric Nelson, said, yes, but there are mitigating factors. 19 years on the police department, volunteering for lots of different shifts. Otherwise, generally speaking, from the defense perspective, an honorable record as a Minneapolis Police Department. What is your overall assessment of those two arguments, and do you think, in the end, they will move the judge from where he was when he walked into the courtroom initially this afternoon?
Yeah, well, the prosecution, as the top cop in the jurisdiction, is saying this isn't a problem with policing in general. Derek Chauvin is an aberration, an anomaly. We're going to sequester him, segregate him from law enforcement, and he did a particularly heinous, depraved act that we don't have to take any responsibility for. Derek Chauvin, on the other hand, was arguing I was doing what I was trained to do. I was actually following my training, and if I did something wrong, then the department should be, and policing itself should be also on the hook for what's going on here. I shouldn't be scapegoated. And then I thought it was interesting that of course, the victim impact statements were powerful, compelling, gut-wrenching in their own right. I thought it was interesting to have the mother come on and speak and say, this is a human being. Much of the country looks at this person as a monster, purely and simply, as unmitigated evil in some way. And she said, you will not only be sentencing him, you will be sentencing me. And that's something that you've heard anti-incarceration, kind of decarceration people saying, that we need to think about the cost of imprisonment and the impact on the families. And a lot of those people are arguing against the new Jim Crow and racialized mass incarceration when they say that. So it's interesting to hear that argument now being made by the mother of a police officer saying, consider the price you're paying. And maybe, some would say, why don't we consider that price more? Maybe we should move in that direction more. But I suspect that the judge here is probably going to go in that, as Keir was saying, in that 20, 25 range, maybe 30.
Lorenzo, I want to ask you about Terrence Floyd, George Floyd's brother, who asked the judge not only for the maximum sentence, but he said, don't let this be a slap on the wrist. Our community has seen that enough. We don't want that in this case. That counteracts, or at least attempts to counteract, what Carolyn Palenti, Derek Chauvin's mother, said, asking for something much more lenient. Broadly speaking, how do you think those arguments will influence the judge and impact any future relationship in Minneapolis and nationwide between police and our communities?
Well, I think the whole world is watching at this point. And what a lot of people in the community are feeling, particularly those in the Black community, they're not necessarily hoping for justice. What they're looking for is the absence of injustice, because that's what a lot of people have been facing when police officers have gone rogue in the past and have done things like this, and they've gotten a slap on the wrist. So a lot of people are kind of optimistically hoping that the right thing is going to happen and that the judge will go a little bit more harshly than leniently. And I think that's what a lot of people want. And I think that would also be a good sign for most good police officers, because there are very few police officers out there that are siding with what Derek Chauvin has done. They want to distance themselves. Community members want to distance themselves. And again, we need to do this before we can heal and move forward. We have to acknowledge the pain, and somebody has to be held accountable. And levels of accountability are needed first, and then the healing process can go forward.
There are no shortage of voices on this particular story. We want to add another voice to our conversation. Jessica Levinson, she is a CBS News legal contributor and professor at Loyola Law School. Jessica, I want to ask you about something that Eric Nelson said, the defense attorney for Derek Chauvin, at the top of his proceeding. He said, this case lies at the epicenter of a cultural divide. Is that how it looks to you? Because it doesn't seem to me, yes, there are those who have taken up Derek Chauvin's cause in this, but it seems to me the preponderance of feeling in this country, not just among prosecutors, police, but the country at large, is this is a moment, a shocking, horrific moment, and it's not a divide. It's like a pursuit of justice to, if not redress previous injustice, but at least get it right in this case.
I completely agree with you, and I wish I could say something else, because it would make for a more interesting conversation if I said, well, yes, but on the other hand. And when I heard that, I just kind of shook my head, and I thought, look, there's only so much that he can argue, and therefore I think he's trying to say there's a schism. We heard Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, later say things like, I've heard from people on both sides, continuing this theme of, I know that a lot of people are pushing you to say that we should do something that's very stringent. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people pushing for something lenient. He said, you know, they're both family men, really trying to, I think, treat this as almost an apples to apples situation. But no, I think you're exactly right that we have achieved as a nation, I think, largely a moment of reckoning about the criminal justice system, where we might have different views about how to get to a better place. But I think there's widespread acknowledgement that there has been systemic injustice. And this idea that the country is divided, at least from my perspective, is one that, you know, it's one of the few things he has left to argue, but is not a particularly compelling idea.
I want to ask you about the statistical part of Eric Nelson's presentation near the end, because he has to know, and the judge has to know, that whatever the statistical numbers suggest in previous sentencing of second-degree murder cases, this one is different, that it's different for a law enforcement officer. It's different if the judge has already agreed that there's an aggravating circumstance based on lack of carrying out that requirement of being a police officer, carrying out the public trust. I guess he has to argue that way as best he can, but he also has to know deep down inside that that is probably unlikely to persuade the judge.
I think so, and frankly, I feel like I had a little deja vu all over again from watching the trial, where I remember having a conversation saying, look, there's only so many places he can go with this case. And I think there's only so many places he can go with this sentencing. Now, if we look at the sentencing, yes, presumptively, you are looking for a first offender at 12.5 years in Minnesota for second-degree murder. But there's so many things, as we said, about this situation that are unique. The aggravating factors that were mentioned, the issues of children being there, the duty of care, the particular cruelty. Now, there is something, however, I think that's in favor of seeing a lighter sentence, which is there is a fairly old, or it's just a few decades old, Supreme Court case where the court acknowledges, it dealt with a Los Angeles Police Department officer, and the court acknowledges when it comes to putting police officers in prison, they're probably going to be in solitary for their own protection. And that type of solitary confinement with which Officer Chauvin is now serving can be, in fact, a harder psychological type of time. So that could be viewed as a mitigating factor. Having said all that, I don't think the statistics here, I mean, we're talking about a defense attorney who asked for probation. You know, he has a duty under the law to vigorously advocate for his client. It doesn't mean that his advocacy is going to win the day, and in this case, I don't think it will.
Right. It's worth pointing out that neither attorney, neither the defense attorney nor the prosecutor, spent very much time, if any, on the probation part of this conversation. Kira, I want to ask you about something that Derek Chauvin said. He was given an opportunity to speak to the court. He offered condolences to the Floyd family, and then he said something I'd like to get your reaction, whatever it might be, to saying, as he turned to the family, there's other information that may come out, and I'm paraphrasing here, that may give you some peace of mind. Any reaction to that from your courtroom experience or your understanding of the law or what he might have been driving at?
I don't know. It seemed very speculative to me. It almost, it didn't seem particularly helpful to me. You know, the circumstances here, he's charged in a federal case. His ability to speak here is limited because, as we've mentioned earlier, he can hurt himself with what he says. If he says something that is incriminatory or directly related to the conduct that he's being sentenced for now. So he was on very tricky ground. But that particular remark, I thought was, you know, like teasing something that he knows it's going to come out. I thought was not particularly helpful, and frankly, my reaction would be one of being unsettled. If I were in Mr. Floyd's family, I would be unsettled by that. I'm not sure that that's helpful at all.
Lorenzo, if I could, let me ask you about the totality of not only what Derek Chauvin said, what briefly he said, but also what his mother, Carolyn Palenti, said. There was no reference from his mother, and we can all understand a mother's love for her son and advocacy for her son in any set of circumstances. But she didn't say anything to the Floyd family in general or in specific, and she said, I still believe in your innocence. And to the earlier conversation we had, when you sentence Derek Chauvin, Judge, you're also sentencing me, deeply personalizing this, but not sending anything of a personal condolence in the direction of the Floyd family. In general, how do you think that will be viewed within the community at large and those watching this trial very, very closely?
Well, as we're watching this and as we're doing this in live time, I'm actually paying attention to social media and Twitter. And a lot of people are saying all sorts of negative things about those comments. We expect that from a mother, but the fact that it didn't speak at all to the death in the Floyd family, didn't send condolences at all, that actually didn't resonate at all with a lot of people on social media. And I think it was problematic in the fact that we have lost a life here. Somebody is dead because of the actions of your son, but yet you still paint him as an angel. That did not resonate on social media at all. And I don't think that was helpful at all, but it's also not unexpected. That is what we expect a mom to say about her child.
Just to reset the situation for our audience here, Judge Peter Cahill, presiding, has said he will come back to the courtroom 2:45 local time. That's about 2.5, 3 minutes away, if in fact he does come at that time. Jody, I want to just give you an open-ended question here based on the things we've talked about or things we haven't yet talked about that you think are worth elevating before Judge Cahill comes back to the bench.
Just that it's interesting that we're in a moment of accountability, demanding accountability for police misconduct. At the same time, we're at a historical moment when we're asking ourselves to rethink blame and punishment, to move away from retribution, retaliation, and revenge as a way of approaching even violent criminals and move toward restoration, redemption, and rehabilitation. You saw Larry Krasner in Philadelphia beat down, trounce an opponent in his second run, Chase Boudin up in San Francisco, George Gascon down here in LA. A lot of voters are getting behind a new way of approaching and thinking about blame and punishment that doesn't really kind of play on this kind of script that we're seeing today, which is understandable, that maybe the way you show you care is by heaping more punishment on the victimizer, right? But that moral compass got us 30, 40 years of racialized mass incarceration that we call the new Jim Crow. So it's a moment for us to sit back and reckon with and think about that tension.
Jody, thank you very much for your thoughts. Control room, where are we? Do we see? We're still waiting for Judge Cahill to come back to the bench. I want to continue the conversation. Keir, help the audience from your experience as a former federal prosecutor. What are we likely to see? Is this going to be right as soon as he gets to the bench? He's going to start saying this, and we're going to get to the meat of this matter.
I think he'll get to it pretty quickly, but I expect that he may make remarks about the two versions of Derek Chauvin that you see in a sentencing of a defendant, right? So you see the conduct, the horrible conduct throughout the trial, and then you see at sentencing the picture or the alternate picture of of a loving son, of a father, of someone who was devoted to his job on the police department, portrayed as someone who was trying to be a good member of society. And this is why every judge that I've ever heard speak about sentencing says that this is the most difficult part of their job. They have to reconcile what they see in the trial with the sentencing presentation by the defense and in the PSR of someone like this with no prior criminal history of behaving in completely different ways. So I think you may see the judge acknowledge the presentations on both sides and the two versions of Derek Chauvin that have been presented to us, and then I think quickly you'll understand, or you'll get to how the judge sees the case.
And Keir, understanding that we're under the time elements here, if the judge walks back in, I'm going to have to cut you off, but as I understand it, it was put before the judge to decide if these other aggravating circumstances existed, not before the jury. Does that matter, and is that important in any way that we should be thinking about?
Well, it matters in the sense that it allows the judge to depart upward. As we've also heard, the mitigating factors, perhaps the idea that he will be in solitary confinement as a mitigating factor is something that the judge may weigh to counterbalance those things. But the judge has a lot of discretion now. As we started off, the polls here are 30 years on the one hand asked by the prosecutor, probation and time served on the other. The judge really could land anywhere in that range, but I expect it to be closer to 30 given the circumstances here.
Lorenzo, again, understanding that we're under a tight time constraint, possibly. The judge could walk in at any minute, but I want to give you an opportunity, and I don't want to put undue pressure on you, speaking for everyone in the quote-unquote community, but in general, based on your experience, your lived experience, the conversations you have and are having, what do you think the level of anticipation is across the country right now as we wait for Judge Cahill to come back to the bench?
I think most people are thinking that it's going to go a little longer than shorter. There's still a lot of people who think that, history has shown us that we don't do a really good job holding bad cops accountable. So a lot of people are bracing for that. But even when I'm training police officers around the country and talking to them privately, even they're saying that this was really bad and that this should be a pretty long sentence.
This is really bad. And they also say, I wonder if you are hearing, it's an anomaly. It's so outside of bounds, it's not really a part or shouldn't be a part of overall police reform in general. Are you hearing that pushback? And if you are, do you believe that is justified?
I am hearing that. No, I don't think it's justified at all, because all of this plays into what reform is. We're trying to make policing better, and we keep hearing time and time again that there's one or two bad apples. Well, actually, there's a whole lot of bad apples, and we need police reform. We need it from the legislative perspective. We cannot expect policing to fix itself. So we need all sorts of intervention from all sorts of places to let the good police officers continue to be good officers, but hold the bad officers accountable.
Lorenzo, let me pick up on that. When you say we need reforms, if you could, one or two that you think would be essential to this conversation, essential to a new reality in the way police officers interact, de-escalate or deconflict situations that in the past have led to the use of lethal force.
I think the problem is we start at the point where the citizen and the police officer come in contact with each other. We need to go way before that. Instead of reimagining policing, we need to reimagine training. We need to increase levels of empathy and compassion. We need to increase critical thinking skills and communication skills. We need to get police officers out of their car into the community. We need police officers to understand the lived experience of the people that they're policing. That way, the police won't seem like an occupying army of outsiders, and they'll seem like they're part of the community. That's where we need to start with policing. We need to overhaul policing, the whole way we do it, the whole way we do training. And I think we can do that, but we need legislative help doing it.
Lorenzo, I'm going to continue this conversation with you because it's an important topic and you have some particularly powerful insights. I've covered legislatures in Washington the Congress since 1990. I've also paid a lot of attention to state legislatures, and I can hear them saying already, wait a minute, Lorenzo, all the things you described are kind of atmospheric. They're holistic. We write laws with specific language and specific words that are scrutinized for years and years afterwards. How do we come up with legislative language that begins to put into paper and put into action what you've just described?
I think it's about how the laws are written. First of all, to say that using a chokehold is against policy tells me I can still do it, but I'll get a slap on the hand. But saying that using a chokehold is illegal and we will then charge you criminally is a very different thing. The level of accountability that we need starts there. And to borrow the final summation from the OJ trial, who polices the police? We can't allow the police to do that. We need legislative reform at a national level.
On the bench. We are going to pause for a moment in our coverage so we can begin a CBS News special report. This is a CBS News special report. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. The nation's eyes are on a courtroom in Minneapolis as former officer Derek Chauvin is sentenced for murdering George Floyd. He faces a maximum of 40 years. Judge Peter Cahill is about to deliver the sentence. Let us listen in.
That you took the time to stay with this case and to provide me with input. I have reviewed the pre-sentence investigation and carefully considered all the facts of the case and the law. But my comments are actually going to be very brief because most of it's going to be in writing. I have a 22-page memorandum that is going to be attached to the sentencing order. And why am I doing it in writing? To emphasize the fact that determining the appropriate sentence in any case, and in this case, is a legal analysis. It's applying the rule of law to the facts of an individual and specific case. And that is why, as opposed to trying to being profound here on the record, I prefer that you read the legal analysis that explains how I determined the sentence in this case. What the case is, or what the sentence is not based on, is emotion or sympathy. But at the same time, I want to acknowledge the deep and tremendous pain that all the families are feeling, especially the Floyd family. You have our sympathies. And I acknowledge and hear the pain that you are feeling. I acknowledge the pain not only of those in this courtroom, but the Floyd family who are outside this courtroom and other members of the community. It has been painful throughout Hennepin County, throughout the state of Minnesota, and even the country. But most importantly, we need to recognize the pain of the Floyd family. I'm not going to attempt to be profound or clever because it's not the appropriate time. I'm not basing my sentence also on public opinion. I'm not basing it on any attempt to send any messages. A trial court judge, the job of a trial court judge is to apply the law to specific facts and to deal with individual cases. And so, Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentenced for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You are granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis. Anything further from the state?
If this needs to be said, we just ask that it be executed forthwith.
Defendant is remanded to the custody of the sheriff to be transported back to the DOC or whichever custody is currently holding him. Anything for the defense?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you. We are adjourned.
Judge Peter Cahill has just announced the sentence of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, 22.5 years. Jamie Yukas of CBS has covered this court case from the very beginning. She joins us now from Minneapolis. Jamie, set the scene. If there's any reaction out there or what you have your own reaction based on what you heard before this verdict being announced there in Minneapolis.
Well, I think everyone, including the crowd behind me in front of the government center, was surprised when Derek Chauvin's mother came up and addressed the courtroom. Many people there not happy about it. She obviously had a very tough time going through. Derek Chauvin also addressing very briefly, could not make a large statement, said that he has some legal issues that he has to clear up before he makes a formal public statement, but did say that he did feel remorse for the Floyd family. That's the first time we have heard him say something like that. I believe you're seeing pictures from right outside the courthouse right now where some demonstrators had gathered. 22.5 years was what many people thought would in fact happen. They thought anywhere from 20 to 25 because of those aggravating factors that the judge would take into consideration. It's interesting that he noted in the particular cruelty that was laid upon George Floyd during the 9.5 minutes that Derek Chauvin was on Floyd's neck as the aggravating factor that he took into account. That's something that we will take a look at, if many years to come as to how he made this decision. Again, he said that he has a 22-page written statement that he's going to add to what happened today with the sentencing. So we will see in detail. That was a little bit of a surprise too, Major, that he didn't come out. Many legal experts had thought that he would give very detailed and specific reasons as to why he came to that 22.5-year sentence. Again, that's about 10 years longer than the Minnesota state guidelines would have given Derek Chauvin based on the fact that he had no prior criminal record. His attorney, Eric Nelson, the defense attorney, had stated that he is concerned about Derek Chauvin's safety. That was a reason that the defense had asked for probation in this case with time served. Now, Derek Chauvin will get credit for about 199 days. That's how long he's been in prison. We know he's in solitary confinement at this point. And again, as the sentence was being read, it was interesting to note that he did not show much emotion in this case. From start to finish. Major?
Jamie Yukas, thank you very much. CBS News legal contributor and civil rights attorney Alexis Hogue joins us. Alexis, the prosecution asked for 30 years. The judge handed down 22.5 years. He said that sentence was not based on emotion, sympathy, public opinion, or messaging. Your reaction?
Yeah, good afternoon, Major. I can't say that I'm surprised by this sentence. I think back to former police officer in Minnesota, Mohammed Noor, who was actually convicted of a lesser account, so third-degree murder, and received a 12.5-year sentence. And so I knew going into today, because Chauvin was convicted of a greater crime, second-degree murder, that he would receive longer than 12.5 years. And even though Judge Cahill did not speak to emotion and sentiment, this is a very carefully and closely watched case, not just in Minnesota, but all around this nation and really around the world. And I think he felt the weight of that. And he very much is still within the framework of what Minnesota law allows for him to sentence Mr. Chauvin. So I can't say that I'm surprised, and I'm eager to read this 22-page memo.
I'm sure you are. Alexis, before I let you go, for those who would have liked to have seen 30 years or maybe even the maximum of 40 years because they considered this crime so brutal, what would you say to them as they work through the processing of this announced sentence?
Father God, we come before you
Even with the convictions that we heard in April at the conclusion of the trial, the convictions, the sentence, they don't really speak to the underlying concerns that still exist, which is that Black people, brown people, people of color experience greater degrees of violence when they have contact with the criminal legal system, with police officers. And so these are unaddressed issues that this sentence, even the maximum amount of sentence, wouldn't address. And so I think it's so important to focus on moving forward for Mr. Floyd's family. I'm hopeful that this sentence gives them some amount of relief, but it doesn't solve our problems. And this is why I am heartened to see the crowds, the vocal crowds in Minneapolis that are as concerned and as committed to really overhauling the way that police officers interact with the public.
Thank you very much. I want to bring in now CBS News legal analyst Ricky Clement. Ricky, it's an oversimplified question to say what's your reaction, but I'm going to do it anyway. What's your reaction?
My reaction is that I am not surprised by the sentence. I think many of us who have taken our lives and dealt with the criminal justice system as both prosecutors and defenders, as I have, would have expected a sentence between 20 and 30 years. So he was well within that range. There was not really a path to give Derek Chauvin the presumptive sentence in light of the aggravators that were put forth by the prosecution and explained by the prosecutor today, particularly the act of cruelty of Derek Chauvin, as well as looking at his abuse of authority. I thought the prosecutor's argument was highly persuasive in court about the fact that when you have someone in custody, he is in your care, and that Derek Chauvin did not show care to George Floyd. I think that there will be people who are disappointed that he did not get this quote-unquote maximum, which is 30 years, but certainly 22 and a half years is a very substantial sentence when, without the aggravators, unintentional murder, which is the conviction in this case of second-degree felony murder, unintentional murder, that really would have carried a presumptive of 12 and a half. I think that people like lawyers and academics will think that the sentence was very fair. People in the community might not.
Ricky, I want to have you listen, and the audience as well, to Derek Chauvin. He spoke ever so briefly. It was a dramatic and brief moment within the courtroom. He is still appealing his conviction, probably one of the reasons his comments were so brief, but he did, for the first time, address the Floyd family. Let's listen.
I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. There's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest, and I hope things will give you some peace of mind. Thank you.
Ricky, I'm not trying to ask you the most difficult question here, which is, what is that about? But do you think that there's anything in the totality of the condolences, but also there's going to be more information that might give you some peace of mind? I'm just not sure how that would land with the Floyd family. It seems like a one and the other kind of thing.
Well, it's really, I think, a bizarre statement, and I think that's kind coming from me. I think it would have been fine if all he said was that he wanted to give his condolences to the Floyd family. We would have heard him say that. I don't think it would make any difference to the Floyd family, nor perhaps should it make any difference, but at least it would be some kind of contrition. But this little carrot and stick approach of saying, well, there's more to come, I just found that not only bizarre, it's almost in its own way sadistic. It's like a nasty tease. If I were his lawyer and had vetted what he was going to say, I would have never permitted him to utter that second or third sentence. It was, I guess, the phrase that we have shared amongst ourselves is that it's like gaslighting. It was not only not in good taste, it was about the last thing that the Floyd family and all of their grieving needed today.
Right. I don't think anyone in that courtroom expected Derek Chauvin to basically say, stay tuned. Ricky Clement, thank you so much for your help. I want to bring in Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, CBS News contributor and lead anti-racist scholar. Dr. Kendi, You've probably watched the proceedings, your overall assessment.
Well, first, I'm hoping that the Floyd family, that this sentencing today could ease some of their grieving. I'm certainly, I thought that he should have gotten more years in prison, and the reason being is because one of the ways we should consider these types of cases is if George Floyd would have been convicted of unintentional murder of Derek Chauvin, would he have only gotten 22 and a half years? You know, that's the type of equal punishment that I think people in the community are looking for. But at the same time, it is so rare for a police officer to be convicted and sentenced for this long. And so I'm hoping that it certainly provides some ease for the Floyd family.
Dr. Kenda, I want to ask you about the way this whole case began. You know, I know, many of the American people know the sanitized version the Minneapolis Police Department originally released about George Floyd's death. That was not true. That was a non-factual assertion of what happened. That was blown up by the facts and citizens who were there, who recorded this for all time on their cell phone video. That part of this story is somewhat forgotten, but it seems crucial to me as we look at the arc of what this is and what it may represent in the future. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Major, I'm happy you reminded us of that, because when we think of the murder of George Floyd, we're not going to be able to separate it from the series of demonstrations, you know, millions of people from coast to coast, from the largest of cities to the smallest of towns, people of all races and ages who came together and demonstrated, you know, against racism and police violence, who saw the murder of George Floyd in all of its horror, and it drove them to speak out and to call forth for a complete transformation of our, you know, criminal legal system. And that may not have happened, right, if the official report, the official police report, would have held the day. And I think it just allows us to really step back. And unfortunately, when there is police violence, is it possible for us to believe the word of the police? And I think this case shows us that it's not.
Dr. Ibrahim X. Kendi, I want to thank you very much for joining us once again to remind the audience what just happened. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin has been sentenced to 22 and a half years for second-degree murder in the death of George Floyd. Our coverage of this ongoing story continues, of course, on our 24-hour streaming service. That is CBSN. You can watch it at cbsnews.com or download our CBS News app on your phone or connected TV. There will be more on your local news on this CBS station and tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Major Garrett in Washington.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
Garrett here in Washington. Let's bring in our panel: Jody Armour, Lorenzo Boyd, Jessica Levinson, and Keir Dougal. Jody is a law professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Lorenzo is Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of New Haven. Jessica is a CBS News legal contributor and professor at Loyola Law School. Keir is a CBS News legal contributor and former federal prosecutor. Okay, we've got all the titles out of the way. It's great to have you all back with me. Let's continue our conversation. Jody, this process of the victim impact statement, it is not a brand new thing to criminal justice, but when I started covering police news back in the mid-'80s, these did not exist. They are an outgrowth of a sort of victims' justice pursuit that went on in the 80s and 90s. Maybe in some jurisdictions they existed back then, but when I was covering police news in Texas in the mid-'80s, they didn't exist. What is the general importance of victim impact statements, and are they for the community at large to get a sense and to hear from the victims, or do they genuinely influence or impact the actual sentencing a judge is about to hand down?
Well, we just heard some impact statements that I think, Major, you agree, were hard to ignore, were hard to not feel very moved by. And lawyers and judges are people too. right? So people are going to be moved by those kinds of appeals. We can say all we want about the rule of law. The rule of law has lots of interstices that allow for discretion. And through that discretion, people's humanity, their humanness comes out and affects their decision making. So victim impact statements are controversial and should be, though, because they actually make the amount of blame and punishment we're going to heap on somebody often turn on something that's beyond their control compared to someone else. For example, let's say we had two people driving negligently down the street, each hits a pedestrian. One pedestrian doesn't have any family members that'll come to court and give impact statements. The other pedestrian who was killed has a large family, gives a lot of impact statement, so evidence, and is gut-wrenching in when they give it about how much they're going to miss and lose and miss the loved one that's lost. So the first defendant may be looking at a much reduced sentence compared to the second, based on a fortuity over which neither had control. That is whether the person injured happened to have a family or not. So a lot of times the victim impact statements kind of distract us from what is supposed to be the focus of the criminal justice process, blame and punishment process, which is the subjective culpability of the defendant, not, fortuities beyond his or her control.
Jessica, Judge Cahill was pretty brief in his description of the sentence and the underlying reasons behind it, saying, please read my 22-page memo attached to this. Is that typical for judges? I know you want to read that 22-page memo. Trust me, I want to read it. But do you think that that is consistent with the intense scrutiny the judge knew he would face, whatever he decided, and he wanted to have a basis separate from whatever he said at the bench to talk about it?
Yes, I think it is consistent with the fact that there is everything kind of abnormal about this case. I don't want to imply that police brutality is a one-off situation. What I want to imply is that this case is unique in the sense that there are so many criminal cases happening right now.
Jessica, with your permission, let me jump in because Keith Ellison, the Minnesota Attorney General, is speaking at the mics. Let's listen to the Attorney General.
About the impact of this horrific crime on their family. We heard for the first time from George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter. What a delightful, beautiful child. And my heart really is with the entire Floyd family as they figure out how to explain to her what happened as she grows up. The sentence that the court just imposed on Derek Chauvin, 270 months or 22 and a half years, is one of the longest a former police officer has ever received for an unlawful use of deadly force. Like the conviction of Derek Chauvin 2 months ago, today's sentencing is not justice, but it is another moment of real accountability on the road to justice. It's difficult to see anyone lose their freedom, but seeing somebody lose their life through torture over 9.5 minutes is incomparably worse. Those minutes and seconds are inerasably seared into the minds of people across the world who watched George Floyd die. Above all, the heroic people who stopped and bore witness to George Floyd's suffering and torture, who came forward a year later to testify about what they saw, and to the Floyd family members themselves and their counsel, Ben Crump, Tony Romanucci, we say thank you. The lives of everyone who saw what happened to George Floyd are forever changed. My hope for Derek Chauvin is that he uses his long sentence to reflect on the choices that he made on May 25th, 2020. My hope is that he will find it within himself to acknowledge the impact of his choices on George Floyd, his family, his fellow police officers, and the world. My hope is that he takes the time to learn something about the man whose life he took and about the movement that rose up to call for justice in the wake of George Floyd's torture and death. Today is also an important moment for our country. The outcome of this case is critically important, but by itself, it's not enough. My hope for our country is that this moment gives us pause and allows us to rededicate ourselves to the real societal change that will move us much further along the road to justice. I'm not talking about the kind of change that takes decades. I'm talking about real change, concrete change that real people can do now. I'm talking to lawmakers. At this historic moment, there is so much legislation around the country. In city councils, county boards, state legislatures, and Congress that is still waiting to be passed. If these bills were passed, they would make the deaths at the hands of law enforcement officers less likely, would improve police community relations, would restore trust and therefore cooperation, improve the lives of officers who want to protect and serve, and make everyone safer. Every one of these bills at every level of government is critical for helping our families, our law enforcement officers, communities, and the country heal. Above all, Congress has still not passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I call on leaders and members of Congress to pass the best and strongest version of this bill that can be passed, and to pass it now. President Biden called on the Congress to pass this bill. It must be passed. Lives are depending upon it. It's just that simple. I'm speaking now to law enforcement leaders. At this historic moment, law enforcement leaders are in a position to finally put in place policy, training, mechanisms, and accountability that can build a police department that people can really trust and rely on. And the elected leaders that they answer to must support and empower these law enforcement leaders to do it. Where there is distrust between community and police, there is less cooperation between community and police. And at a moment where violent crime is spiking across the nation in major cities, we simply cannot afford the distrust. The schism leaves us all a little less safe. But trust and cooperation must be earned. You cannot clean a dirty wound. By bringing accountability in law enforcement, you actually promote public safety. I say to those law enforcement leaders, make no mistake, this is something your officers are asking for. In the aftermath of George Floyd's death, 14 Minneapolis Police Department officers signed an open letter condemning Derek Chauvin's actions and embracing the call for reform and change. These 14 officers don't only speak for themselves, they speak for hundreds across the country. These officers and ones like them want you to support officers who treat everyone with dignity and respect. They want you to support officers who are taking risks to speak up and demand that we do better. They want you to hold their colleagues accountable who refuse to serve communities with dignity and respect. Why do officers want accountability? Well, think of the 9-year-old girl wearing a T-shirt that said love across the front, who witnessed George Floyd's murder, and how she will feel 20 years from now as she may be speaking to her own children about whether to trust law enforcement. The damage that Derek Floyd's crime inflicted upon the reputation of officers is undermining the ability for people to trust, and that is very tragic. It's not fair to judge all police officers by Derek Chauvin's actions, but some people inevitably will generalize unless there is true accountability. You just can't heal a dirty wound, and when there's little trust, sadly, there's little safety. When law enforcement leaders take clear steps to build in accountability and prioritize wellness for their officers, they will have the officers' respect, trust between officers and the people they are dedicated to protecting and serving. Let me speak to prosecutors. We believe, and we state and declare, that no one is above the law and no one is beneath it. A police officer is not above the law, and George Floyd certainly is not beneath the law. When after a thorough review, prosecutors believe that they have probable cause that anyone, including someone operating with the authority of law and law enforcement, has violated the law. Our prosecutors must be vigorous, visible, and swift. I'm speaking to community now. We need every community member to continue the call for real reform and meaningful change. Peacefully, constructively, but clearly. This is a moment for change, and your call for it is making it happen. This means everyone who wants to live in a society with dignity and respect as core values, everyone who wants to be safe in their homes and on the street, everyone who wants to get the help that they need, everyone who wants their loved ones to get home safely. This is what we need to do. What will happen if we don't do it? We will slip deeper into a century-long cycle of inaction. We can and we must make another choice. The choice to break the old paradigm and end the cycle of inaction. The choice to act for accountability and justice. The choice to transform ourselves and our country. For the sake of all the lives that have been lost, for the sake of the terrible sacrifices that too many families like the Floyds have had to make, and for the sake of the many officers who strive to serve and protect with dignity and honor and high standards, and for the sake of the community. Time is up. It's time to act. We're counting on you. We're counting on each other. Finally, I want to thank this extraordinary team of prosecutors. It has been my deepest honor to work with you. You all are the best, and I'm honored to be your colleague. I want to send another strong signal of love and friendship to the Floyd family, who have done so much to uphold the dignity of our community. I want to thank the Hennepin County Attorney's Office and Mike Freeman, who have been side by side with us and have done such a good job, and we appreciate their work. And I want to thank the witnesses who courageously stepped forward for George Floyd on May 25th at risk to themselves and came back a year later to testify about what they saw. And lastly, I want to thank the community for making the call for justice. That's it. Thank you very much.
Reacting to the sentence, 22 and a half years for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. I want to let everyone know that there where you saw the microphones, we might see Ben Crump and the Floyd family in the not-too-distant future. While we await that particular development, I want to go to Jamie Yuccas, who has been covering this legal proceeding from the very beginning. Keith Ellison, the Attorney General, is focused on a couple of things, Jamie. He talked about violent crime, but also accountability within the police department. Violent crime has been on the rise in Minneapolis. Atmospherically, what do you think today's events, his words, and the overall community reaction is likely to be?
Well, it's been a conversation that's been ongoing since the trial and the conviction of Derek Chauvin. And I can tell you there are pockets of the city, as you just said, crime is spiking. They haven't seen violent crime like this since the 1990s, when Minneapolis was dubbed Murder-apolis. There's a section of town called North Minneapolis where 8 residents are actually suing the city, saying they need more police officers. About a quarter of the police officers in the department have either resigned, retired, or taken a mental health break after the George Floyd incident and the trial, saying that it's too much pressure right now. So there are people who are saying we need officers, but we do need accountability, much like what Keith Ellison just spoke about today. A couple things I want to point out quickly to you, Major, that I've learned since the sentencing happened. Minnesota has an automatic, it turns out, good time law where any sentence is reduced by a third. So if you do the math of 22 years minus the time that Derek Chauvin's already served, as the judge indicated, 199 days, that means Derek Chauvin will spend the next 14 years in prison before he is eligible to get out. A couple other notes. As you may recall from the trial itself, we had a number of pool reporters because of the COVID protocols in place. You saw a number of masks still on people inside the courtroom. That the rules were still in place from when the trial began and are still in place at the Government Center here in Minneapolis. So the pool reporters, just a couple of them inside the courtroom themselves, sent out notes. And one particular note I wanted to point out is that Phalonis, George Floyd's brother, who's been very outspoken about how this has changed his life, how much he misses his brother, given multiple media interviews over the last year about just the impact it has had on the entire Floyd family, that just before the sentence was announced, he was in prayer within the courtroom. He sat there with his hands in prayer, praying that the judge would give an aggravated sentence, which he did. He got 10 years longer than what is stated in Minnesota sentencing guidelines. Another particular note we found of interest is that during the trial itself, when I was inside the courtroom, we did see Derek Chauvin's mother on a couple of days come to the courtroom to support her son. She would not look at the reporters when we were there. She didn't identify herself. But today, as she spoke, that's when most of us identified her. But also in the courtroom of interest is Derek Chauvin. When all this occurred, his wife at the time said that she was going to divorce him and became his ex-wife. She, along with her two sons from a previous relationship, were both inside the courtroom today to support Derek Chauvin, which is something that Eric Nelson had put in his filing to say when he wanted probation and time served, that Derek Nelson did have community support and did have people within his family who supported him. So those are of particular note. The other thing we've gotten since the sentencing ended is that we've learned from the judge, in particular, what he took into account for that 22.5-year prison sentence. He said the aggravating factors in particular that he looked at, remember there were 4, but he looked at Chauvin abusing a position of trust and authority as an officer, and that he believed that Derek Chauvin did in fact treat George Floyd with particular cruelty. It is interesting here. The prosecutors seemed to really hammer home as they were presenting their case that children were present. The judge did not find that that was an aggravating factor. Even though there were children present, he did not believe that that should be taken into account in this case. He also goes into detail in his 22-page memorandum that we're still combing through that because with the other aggravating factor that he committed a crime with 3 other officers, that also was not of particular interest to him. He only needed to find one aggravating factor to have that sentence raised from that 12.5 years. He goes into particular detail in the memorandum, too, that the highest sentence he's ever seen was 300 months, and that the average sentence he had seen for this particular case with these types of aggravating factors and a defendant with no criminal record was about 240 months. So he did extend it that 30 additional months in this case, and that is how Minnesota goes about doing their sentencing here in the state. So the other note, as you've been talking about, that people will be taking, I think, quite a look at, and as you talk about the crowd here today, was the fact that Chauvin did speak very briefly. He said he would not give a statement, a full statement at this particular time, but he did express his condolences to the Floyd family. But as you've mentioned, Major, previously, is that he then went on to say, but there will be more information that you may find of interest and give you peace of mind. Many people we saw reacting in a very negative way when he began speaking. People also responding in a negative way when his mother began speaking. It obviously was very difficult for her calling her son a good man, but it was not a good reaction from the crowd. What I'm hearing from people on the street right now is that there's mixed reaction from the crowd. There was some delayed anger, but now as Keith Ellison has spoke, the Attorney General, there does seem to be some calm and people talking about what's next.
With a comprehensive analysis of all the day's events, Jamie Yuccas in Minneapolis, thank you very much. Senator Tina Smith joins us now from Minneapolis. She is one of Minnesota's 2 Democratic senators. Senator Smith, thank you for joining us. I just want to give you an open-ended question, your reaction to today's sentencing. And you heard Jamie Yuccas just say the practical reality is under Minnesota law, 22.5 years actually means 14 years.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Major, and I'm glad to be with you today. I believe that this sentence fits the seriousness of this crime. I appreciated that Judge Cahill, who I've known for many years, particularly called out the abuse of power, abuse of authority, and the particular cruelty of this crime. I think that across Minneapolis, and I suspect across this country right now, we're all thinking about, okay, what's next, and how do we move forward? How do we?
Senator Smith, forgive me. Al Sharpton is at the microphones. We expect him to be joined by Ben Crump and the Floyd family. Let's listen to that.
It's longer than we've ever got, but shorter than what we should have gotten in the past. Let us remember a man lost his life. This is not a prayer of celebration. It's a prayer to thank God for giving the strength to this family and those activists that stayed in the streets to make sure this court had to do what was right. Let me repeat for those in the back, because those are the ones that marched, that this is the longest sentence they've ever given, but it is not justice. Justice is George Floyd would be alive.
Amen.
Justice is that they would have been doing this. Had they done sentences like this before, maybe Chauvin would not have thought he would have gotten away with it. So let us remember the people that you castigated and attacked that marched in Minneapolis and that we marched all over this country that wouldn't stop. And we're not going to stop. One sentence does not solve a criminal justice problem. The United States Senate must show the same courage this jury showed and hold police accountable for murder and make them pay in the court of law maximum for murder. Not a token, not a donation, but full accountability for the actions that you did. Let us pray. Dear God, we come to the same spot we bowed at the beginning of the trial, asking you to give this family strength and give them grace. And you brought us now to the end of this particular proceeding. They will say it is more time than any time in history, but we will say that history has been long underserving its citizens.
Yes.
And we humbly thank you for giving this family the strength to stand where other families didn't even get a court date.
Yes.
We remember
Yes.
Eric Garner today.
Yes.
We remember Michael Brown.
Yes.
We remember Jacob Blake,
Yes.
who is still with us. We remember Tamir Rice on his birthday. 19 years old would have been today. We remember Breonna Taylor.
Yes.
They never got a court date. We did get a court date, a conviction, and some time.
Amen.
Some will say that's progress. I will say, as Malcolm X said, if you have a knife in my back 6 inches, to take out 4 inches is progress, but I still have 2 inches of knife in my back. The knife is still in our back as long as these unresolved cases are there. And the Floyd family and those of us in the civil rights community and the activist community will not stop until justice becomes a matter of federal law and no longer a news story, but the story that we know will follow. Touch the U.S. Senate to see that they must make law so that we will not have little children like George's daughter had to give a judge a statement about the value of a daddy, but they understand that all of your children matter. Yes, black lives matter because you made us all. And we'll be careful to be loyal, and we'll be careful to live up to the calling you've placed on the lives of those that serve, and careful to give your name the praise. These blessings we ask in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Let me bring on now, it's been a long journey, and this is not the end. This is just one stop on the highway toward full justice. None has been more courageous. None has been more consistent. One has not been more unselfish than the Attorney General of Black America, who has stood with this family from day one, came even when the cameras weren't there, and has stayed with the family and other families. Let us bring, before we bring members of the family, Attorney Ben Crump.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reverend Al Sharpton, for leading this family and this country in prayer as we continue to struggle to make the words of liberty and justice for all real in America. I stand here with a great legal team standing firmly with the family of George Floyd. That is Attorney Chris Stewart and Attorney Justin Miller from Atlanta, Georgia, Attorney Tony Romanucci from Chicago, Illinois, and Attorney Jeff Storms from right here in Minneapolis. And at present, we have the brothers of George Floyd, Philonise Floyd, Terrence Floyd, and Rodney Floyd, as well as Brandon Williams. We have his cousins, Sharita Tate and Tara Brown. And we know at home praying we have his sisters, Bridget Floyd, Jaja Floyd, and LaTanya Floyd, and certainly his beautiful daughter, Chris tells me, is looking, smiling, saying that her daddy changed the world, and he will talk more about that later. And we want to acknowledge all his family. We want to acknowledge all of the people who use their voice to say his name. Say his name. Say his name. Say his name. Today represents an opportunity to be a turning point in America. This is the longest sentence that a police officer has ever been sentenced to in the history of the state of Minnesota. But this should not be the exception when a black person is killed by brutality by police. It should be the norm. And so when we think about real justice would be, Silky, that George Floyd would still be here with his family. So what we got today was some measure of accountability. And we understand that there are still federal charges pending. So as his brothers and his family ask for the maximum, we're still holding out for the maximum. That's right. We have to remember real justice in America will be black men and black women and people of color will not have to fear being killed by the police just because the color of their skin. That would be real justice. So we thank most of all the millions of Americans who raised their voice. You all raised your voices, and because you raised your voices, that is why we got the guilty conviction, and that is why we got the longest sentence in the state of Minnesota history. So on behalf of the Floyd family, we want to say thank you to millions of Americans who all said, until we get justice for George Floyd, until we get accountability for George Floyd, none of us can breathe. We can breathe just a little easier today, and we thank you for that.
We got your back.
Thank you all. And I will say this, we got accountability on the civil side, thanks to the leadership of the city leaders in Minnesota. We now have gotten some accountability in the criminal level, but we need accountability on the policy level. So we say to the United States Senate, pass the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act immediately. 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 At this time, I give you one of the finest attorneys in the United States of America. I have had the pleasure of being with a team of lawyers, Reverend Al, who are second to none. And each of them work tirelessly day and night from every corner of America, working on behalf of George Floyd's family. And there is no way we could get to this point where we're at on this journey to justice without all our brothers and sisters, Bhavani Ravindran, Madeline Simmons, Michelle Godot, all of those, Scott Peters, all of them who are working, Scott Madison, they allowed us to come out front to be with the family today, but they are not forgotten. And I know my brother in the bar who just did wonderful things in Louisiana with Alton Sterling, Chris Stewart, appreciates each and every one of the lawyers on our team. At this time, you're going to hear from Attorney Chris Stewart and Attorney Justin Miller.
First, let me start by saying Roxy and Gianna couldn't be here, but right now, Gianna is actually watching. She's watching live. So let me tell you, Gianna, you've done two things in this case. You started by saying, my daddy changed the world. Yes. Yep. I want you to know you changed the world. Because today, that statement that you gave was not just powerful, but it was prophetic. You told us that his spirit is still here. That's right. And people that are doubting, people that are looking at these monuments coming up and the statues coming up of George Floyd and not understanding, you aren't understanding that his spirit is changing things. It doesn't matter who the man was. It matters who he is now. There are conversations happening between black and white that never would have happened before about policing. There are conversations happening between senators that we are pushing and urging to stand up for what you believe in. If you believe in law and order and change, then you will pass this bill because it protects everyone. Nelson Mandela once said, if you change what you believe depending on who you're talking to, you are not fit to lead. That's right. Amen. So we are looking for leadership. We are looking for the spirit of George Floyd, which is in every single person now. We are getting off the sidelines and realizing that if you critique policing, it doesn't mean you hate every cop. It means you want the bad cops gone. And we only will change things by leaving the sidelines and coming together in the middle, no matter what color you are. And that is the spirit of George Floyd. And yes, Gianna has changed the world. It's been an honor and a privilege standing up for this family. It's just been an honor.
First and foremost, I would like to say to the family, my condolences, my prayers from my family and from everyone in Atlanta, from Scott Masterson, Madeline Simmons, Louis Brisbois Law Firm, who put in a lot of work to help get us to the point we are today. Thank you to the family. I know that Mr. Chauvin's mother didn't have any words for the family, but we do, and I know you guys do. So to the family, I say my condolences, and I'm sorry, and we love you, and we love you, because this is what it's about first and foremost, love. Second thing I'll say is this. Until things like this are not national news, we haven't made it. We're still in the same place that we were 20 years ago and 30 years ago. We are all here talking about something that everybody sitting right here knew what should have happened. We knew from day one he murdered George Floyd. We all saw it. But we had to go through this for a year to get to this point where this family can have some modicum, some amount of closure. A year. So I'll say this, until black and brown people in this country can get closure, can depend on the justice system, can know that when someone murders somebody in broad daylight, that they're going to be held accountable, we got a lot of work to do. And I will say to all you people, all you activists, all you people who are fighting from day one, keep working, keep pushing, keep fighting. Keep fighting. Because we have a lot of work to do in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Brookline, Minnesota, Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, I'm sorry, and in New York City, and in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and in North Carolina, and in Los Angeles, California, in Texas and Chicago. We have work to do, so keep pushing. This is a victory, and we're going to celebrate it as a victory. But it's one small step, and we have a lot more to go. So thank you guys for being with us through all of this. Thank you guys for loving this family. And pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. ASAP. ASAP.
Amen. And now, before we get to the family, some great lawyers from Chicago, Illinois, one of the best civil rights lawyers in America, and a great lawyer who hails right here in Minnesota. I mean, without him giving us the lay of the land, there's no way we would have been able to achieve what we have accomplished. Attorney Antonio Romanucci and Attorney Jeff Storms.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Romanucci. What we saw today was the graph intersected, the perfect apex now between civil justice and criminal justice. What we now have today, we have proof that Black lives matter, that they are valuable, and that when you violate policies, you're going to pay, and you're going to pay a lot of money. And when you violate the law, you're going to get prosecuted, and you're going to go to jail. And you're going to go to jail for a long time. And those two lines cross today, and George Floyd now equals justice on both civil and criminal. But the job isn't over. It's not over until we go state to state. Reverend Al, Ben, you all said it so eloquently. We must have the George Floyd police reforming bill passed.
Amen.
If that doesn't get passed, our justice could fall. The graph could fall. We need justice all over America. We want justice for George Floyd. The Floyd family, we continue to love you. We always will. We'll always be a part of your lives. But there are so many other families that are here today that are also suffering and require that same justice, civil and criminal. That's what matters most. Thank you all.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.
Not a lot to say that hasn't been said, but as the local Minnesota lawyer, I just want us to remember that we need all of you. We need the media, we need the activists, because the second we turn around and leave, we have to go back and ask ourselves, how do we get more justice for George Floyd? How do we get justice for Dante Wright? How do we get justice for Winston Smith? How do we get justice for the many families here who are regularly fought for on behalf by people like Tashira Garraway and her group, Nakima Levy Armstrong and her group, and without all of you, we don't have the energy for that fight right here. We need you all to keep turning out, and we appreciate it because it's allowed the Floyd family to get the most historic justice we've ever seen, but it's not enough.
Amen.
Thank you.
Not enough. And as we get ready to bring up the Floyd family, I would be remiss if Brandon, as we heard the sentence, leaned in and whispered in my ear. I got a text from Breonna Taylor's mother congratulating us on getting some justice, the justice that she never got.
That's right.
And I have to tell you, Reverend Al, as Derek Chauvin's mother was standing up there making her comments, I thought of Tamika Palmer, Breonna Taylor's mother. And so it's not enough until we get justice for all of our people who have been killed unjustly. I think Breonna Taylor is with us. Right now, we're going to have you hear from some of the Floyd family members. You've come to know him. He has been speaking at the U.S. Congress, to the United Nations and everywhere, saying that we demand justice for my big brother, George Floyd. He sounds like a politician, Reverend Al. Mr. Philonise Floyd.
Keep fighting. Keep going.
I got a lot of emotions going through my head right now, but I just find it profound that I felt that I begged for justice for my brother, some type of accountability. The treatment that I thought that everybody should receive, it's just life, you know. You can't get that back. We all live together in this world, and we all want to be able to work together in this world. You have good police officers and you have bad ones. The fact that you shouldn't have to sort them out. The community that I grew up in, it was a lot of African American people. But the fact that Minnesota has a greater amount of Caucasian people, I still think that everybody should be the same. Everybody should be neutral. Everybody should want to make a difference and make sure that people, when they come to Minnesota, they don't think about George Floyd. They should be able to think about how great Minnesota is. Not thinking about Philando Castile. You know, his mother is still fighting. Thinking about Dante Wright. Many families I had to console. You think about Anthony McClain. He was killed. All of these people were shot in the back, most of them. The fact that I'm here and I'm still standing, and over a year later, I'm still speaking and I'm speaking out. Times are hard. I have a family, we wake up every day and we don't see my brother. Empty seats all around the house he would have been in. The fact that Gianna would grow up knowing that her father had made a difference in the world, but the fact that she cannot have a sweet 16. She cannot have him walk her down the aisle. She would not be able to have prom with the daddy dance. This is not something realistic. This is something, it's like a dream, but we all need to stand up for what is right.
All right.
All these activists and all these advocates, I thank you all. Definitely I thank you all. Because if you all didn't speak out, we wouldn't have had a lot of help. But the fact that the world, you got to think about Japan. You have to think about Germany. You have to think United Nations. You have to think Italy. I have so many different people I spoke to, Africa, all around the world, and they all think the same way. Right. Your skin color should not define who you are.
Amen.
It should never be a weapon. And the fact that we're here standing today, still breathing, we're still fighting. Reverend Al always said, keep fighting.
Keep fighting.
And that's something I can't stop. I want to tell Miss Carr, I love you.
Yeah.
I know it's hard. That's Eric Garner's mom. I want to tell Breonna Taylor, mom, I love you. Pamela Turner. I know it's hard. I want to tell Pamela Turner, that's Baytown, Texas.
Yeah.
This is not okay. Her daughter is walking around, and I know she's in tears every day thinking about her mother. Her mother was killed in point-blank range, shot multiple times. So many different people all around the world who didn't even have this type of technology. I just want to reiterate, not just Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. We need to stand up and fight. Can't get comfortable, because when you get comfortable, people forget about you.
Amen.
So the legend will still live on. George is not here, but his spirit lives here. Breonna Taylor is not here, but the spirit still lives here. Eric Garner is not here, spirit still right here. But the fact that we're here fighting, I want all you all to stand up and fight. Thank you all so much.
And next we're going to have another brother of George who came all the way from New York. Brooklyn, New York.
In the house.
And as we introduce him, it's not lost on us as Attorney Stewart and Attorney Romanucci and I talk. It's always a journey to justice. Tony told me Laquan McDonough, who was found guilty, his killer, the police officer that killed him, shot him 14 times in the back on video. 16 times in the back on video. And he was convicted of second-degree murder, and he was only sentenced to 6 years. Botham Jones, who in Dallas, Texas, was killed in his own apartment.
Right.
The white policewoman, Amber Geiger, was found guilty of first-degree murder, Reverend Al.
Right.
And she was only sentenced to 10 years. And Justin Miller, where was it, Walter Scott in South Carolina, same conviction, shot in the back, on video, convicted 20 years. So each step, each case, we keep making progress. We came too far to stop now. We have to keep going forward. And so that's why all the energy we have in this courtroom, we have to take to Capitol Hill, and we have to join Senator Cory Booker. We have to join Congresswoman Karen Bass, Senator Tim Scott. We got to say, you all, we need meaningful police reform.
That's right.
So we don't have to put up with these injustices. Seem like, Reverend Al, every other week there's a new hashtag. We can stop this, America. We're at the turning point. Terrence Floyd, Brooklyn, New York.
Let me hear y'all say change.
Change.
Let me hear y'all say change.
Change.
That's right. Just like I heard y'all say change all together, that's how we're going to keep the change going together. Fight, keep fighting. The way we got here is because of our fight and your fight together. Y'all hit the streets, we thankful for y'all, and we just, I'm overwhelmed. I'm overwhelmed, because I'm going to tell you a quick story. I had a dream the other night. I was in a field. I was in a field in the South with my family, and I looked back and I saw a man. I saw a man coming up, walking, and I'm trying to figure out who is that? Who is that? I look. He gets closer, and all of a sudden I see the hat cocked to the side like this. Anybody that know me know who that is. That's my father. So he got close to me, and he gave me a smile, and he gave me a hug. I woke up, that dream was so real, I woke up hugging myself. So I knew, I was a little leery about the sentencing, but because of that, I knew that my father was saying, you good, he's good. Keep doing what you're doing. For me, for your brother, for your name. Because we Floyd strong, and we're going to stay strong. Thank you.
Right. Well said. Thank you, Terrence. Next, we will hear from the nephew of George Floyd, who's like a brother, like a son in many regards to him, Brandon Williams.
Yeah.
It's funny that we got justice, but not enough justice.
That's right.
You know, I remember standing here the first day of trial in this very same spot, and we were very optimistic and unsure of what was going to happen. After seeing that video, we should have been 100% sure that we would be at a guilty conviction with a maximum sentence. When you think about George being murdered in cold blood with a knee on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, execution style in broad daylight, 22 and a half years is not enough. We were served a life sentence. We can't get George back. Gianna can't hug George again. He'll be able to hug his family possibly and see his family again. We can't get George back. So in retrospect, I feel that he should have received a life sentence as well. What kind of message are you sending to our country? What kind of message are you sending to the younger kids like Gianna? That you can kill a man in cold blood and get a slap on the wrist? That's like a slap in the face to all of us standing up here. And everybody around the world who feel what we feel and saw that video. So I won't celebrate this. I won't celebrate it at all. But I will celebrate a guilty conviction on a police officer that killed a black man, because far too many times we see them kill us and get right away with it. I will celebrate this as a victory for Ms. Tamika Palmer, who I'm very, very close with.
Yeah.
I hope that Attorney Daniel Cameron out in Kentucky can follow Keith Ellison's lead and charge the cops who killed Breonna Taylor. So there are some positive things to take from this. But this 22 and a half years just isn't one for me. Thank you.
All right.
All right, Brandon. From the heart, Brandon. And we have his brother, his baby brother, Rodney Floyd from Houston, Texas, 3rd Ward.
Hey, how y'all doing? You know, I would like to thank the protesters first, the local protesters. And in this city, I would like to thank all the protesters that came out across the country to this city and standing up in their cities as well, demanding change. we all have one thing in common. We want change for my brother's case. This right here is this 22-year sentence they gave this man. It's a slap on the wrist. We serving a life sentence and not having him in our life. And that hurts me to death. And looking at his daughter, beautiful daughter, Gianna, in her video, saying the first video, my dad changed the world. He did change the world. But at the end result, he gets a slap on the wrist. My nephew just said, 22 years from killing her dad, that she can't take her to the school. He can't eat lunch with her. He can't conversate with her. I know with my daughter, I love my daughter. Hugs her, we talk, that's my little best friend. And I hate to see that he cannot have that, she can't have that connection with her father. Those great conversations, those wonderful phone calls, lighting up her face, you know. And around the world, black, white, brown, we all need to come together, take our bus to the Senate, stand out there, and demand this George Floyd Act be passed, and also, as well as the act being passed. We need to stand there, put pressure on this Senate. Right. You know, and I was thinking last night, guys, honestly, we heard Obama say this plenty of times, get out and vote. We hear so many folks say get out and vote. Everybody got out and voted, marched in these streets, and we got change. We got our first black president. A lot of people came together like they did now, my brother's death, and we got this. But guess what, people? We need to take that same energy and bring that back to that Senate and demand them pass that bill. Amen. Because as we've seen Trump numerous times stand up, fussing on camera numerous times, countless times, because he did not have the power that we thought he had to get something done. He had to call on the Senate. And we need to get out there, understand that message. Go to the Senate, put pressure on the Senate, and get these bills and laws passed for all of us. Amen. Can stand on them with this American flag as one. And we, as black people, need to know this American flag represents us, because we feel it don't.
All right. All right. Thank you, Rodney. And as we bring his cousin, Sharita, please understand, this is only one step in getting accountability in the criminal level. The federal charges are still pending. So I do believe that when Phalonis and Terrence and Rodney say the maximum, it is still attainable to get maximum accountability for George Floyd. 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 Now you will hear from his cousin, Sharita Tate.
Come on, Sharita. Hello, everybody. I won't spend a whole lot of time sort of reiterating what my family has already said. I think they have spoke very eloquently about how we've dealt with this last year and our thought processes as it relates to the amount of time that Derek Chauvin was given. Truth be told, I don't think any sentence would be enough, because what truly would be justice would be for us to be able to have George back. But with that being said, I'd just like to take this time to thank the countless number of people that have been supportive of us since the very beginning. I remember when we first came here and we were talking about the sentence and the trial and what potentially the outcome would be. And as we sat through the trial and watched the murder over and over again and came back with the 3 convictions, then we all waited and waited for this day. I will have to say that we didn't get what we wanted. We definitely wanted to see the maximum penalty, but however, as they've already stated, we do have the federal ahead of us, and we are hoping that we can get some real accountability with him getting a life sentence. And lastly, I just want to speak on the Policing Act. You know, we've had it partially, it's before the Senate, and I would just say, echo what everyone else has said. We need this passed immediately. We need to really have some true accountability across the board. Thank you.
And finally, before we take a few of your questions, we have his cousin Tara Brown from Houston, Texas.
Okay.
I just want to say, you know, my family has spoken a lot about everything that we've gone through since we started this journey. And I will tell you, it definitely has been a journey for us. And as a family, we decided that we were committed to two things. For sure, we wanted to make sure that we got some measure of justice for George and for the countless other families who have lost loved ones in the way that we did. And the other thing is that we were committed to making sure that we force the change that we want to see and create this legacy that will live on forever. Just want to say thank you to everybody who has supported us throughout this journey, especially the protesters and the activists who have been nonstop and relentless, and they've helped us get to this point. And the other thing is, we want to say that this bill needs to get passed, and I want to make sure that we don't stop just with this bill, but it's important that you hold your states, elected officials accountable to that as well. We are also looking at the local level where they're making change. Even in our city, where we're from in Houston, there has been some changes already. Our mayor, Sylvester Turner, has, you know, banned chokehold, and you know, we have qualified immunity is on the table. So we are keeping active, and we want to make sure that you stay in the fight. Please keep fighting. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. And finally, our national leader, Reverend Al Sharpton.
We're going to open up the questions for the family and all of us. Let me say this so you're clear. If there is conviction in the federal trial and he is convicted and the other three, that federal time can run after the 22 and a half years.
Amen.
It does not have to run concurrent, which is why we're saying that we still want full justice. Secondly, when we talk about the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, we know the difference, Senate, between two slices of bread and a sandwich. A sandwich has meat between the two slices of bread. Don't come down with a compromise that is two slices of bread with no meat in the middle. Don't put George Floyd's name, a strong man, on a weak bill. Make sure that you talk to those in the family and those of us involved in the struggle before you make any compromise. The difference between a compromise and a sellout is in the eye of the appraiser. Wow. And we will be part of the appraisal. Questions?
Yes, I have a question for the family. I have a question with regard to the family. Yeah, and I'd like to pose a question to one of the family members, whomever would like to answer it.
What's the question?
During this news conference in last June, Attorney General Ellison issued a clarion call to the arts and entertainment community to take the mantle in seeking justice. Any one of the family members can answer why that might be important to them or why it may not.
Why to get artists and entertainers involved. Philonis will attempt to answer your question, but we want to invite other families who are here who have lost loved ones due to police brutality to also come forward. Mr. Floyd, can you answer that question?
Ellison called entertainers to stand and
Okay.
I mean, just tell me you shouldn't have
we may answer that question on the side for you. Okay.
Question about the case, sir.
Okay. Question about the case. And Attorney Starnes, where are the other families?
Today in court, Derek Chauvin offered condolences to the family. I was wondering what you thought about that, and also Derek Chauvin's mother continued to say that her son was innocent and that people did not know her son like the family did. And I was wondering what you thought about those comments. The condolences from Derek Chauvin and the mother saying that her son was innocent and people did not know Derek Chauvin like her family did.
All right. I just thought about it as the same thing with my brother. People didn't know who my brother was. They labeled him. The trial was all about my brother. Instead, it should have been about Mr. Chauvin. So the things that she spoke about, I understand that because that's her son. Same way she spoke up for her son, I spoke up for my brother. So we all love our loved ones, but the fact that I will never see my brother again is worse because she still will have the opportunity to see her son in the cell anytime she wants to.
That's right. Let me say something about that with Philonise. When I heard his mother speak, and I respect any mother stand up for their son, but it reminded me, and I said it in the eulogy right here, that George called for his mother. And the one that seemed not to understand the bond between a mother and son, when a son would call for his mother that was no longer alive, was not the Floyd family, it was her son Derek. Because that did not make him stop when he heard a man call for his mother. I respect his mother. He did not respect George calling for his mother.
Thank you, Rev. We want to acknowledge Bishop Harding, who was over the Salvation Army where George worked, and George did so much great. So let's acknowledge and give him a round of applause for the great work they do. Now we're going to turn it over to a lady who needs no introduction here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She's a lawyer, she's an activist, and she's a freedom fighter. Y'all give it up for my sister, Nakima. And she's going to introduce some other families.
Please,
Queen.
Good afternoon. It's our honor to stand here with the family of George Floyd and the lawyers who continue to represent this family in their continued pursuit of justice. This is one step towards progress, but this is not justice, and this is not full accountability as the family has asked for. I'm Nakima Levy-Armstrong. I'm a civil rights attorney based here in Minneapolis, and I'm standing next to Tashira Garraway, who is part of Family Supporting Families Against Police Violence, Jaylani Hussein from CARE Minnesota, and Michelle Gross from Communities United Against Police Brutality. And we are all here as people who stand on the front lines with the folks who are here from the Twin Cities who hold it down time and time again. We got to give it up for the activists and the organizers who face rubber bullets, tear gas, arrests, and demonization for standing up for George Floyd and all stolen lives. This incident today of Derek Chauvin being sentenced is something that we've been waiting for a long time. The sad part about his sentence is that we know that black men often receive more time for doing less than what Derek Chauvin did. There are plenty of black men and Latino men in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. But here we have a veteran officer who was literally able to lynch someone in broad daylight in the presence of children and other witnesses and essentially get a proverbial slap on the wrist. That is not acceptable. Judge Cahill should have held him accountable to the fullest extent of the law. It is not enough that he has received the most time from compared to other police officers who have killed people. This is a new day. It's not based on what they did in the past when they could lynch us and get away with it, when they could brutalize us and get away with it, when they could kill people and get away with it. Just because it's the most time does not mean that it is enough time. So we will continue to stand up and fight alongside this family and everyone else who cares about justice in demanding that the federal government now step in and hold Derek Chauvin and those other 3 police officers who were involved in killing George Floyd accountable to the fullest extent of the law. If the federal government had stepped in a long time ago, George Floyd might still be alive today. So that is the least that they can do in this situation. And I want to encourage all the activists, the organizers, the community members who are sitting at home to get off the couch and come down to the government center to stand in solidarity with Family Supporting Families and other organizing groups, as well as a 9 o'clock nighttime peaceful demonstration that's going to happen downtown. Thank you all for being here. Realize we're not sleeping in the Twin Cities, and we're going to continue to stand up and fight for justice. Thank you. My name is Tashira Garraway. I am the founder of Family Supporting Families Against Police Violence. I am also the mother of Justin Tigan's 15-year-old son, who was brutally beat to death by the St. Paul police and thrown inside of a trash dumpster August 19, 2009. I stand here in solidarity with Emmett Till's family, Travis Jordan family, Brian Quinonez family, Demetrius Hill, Jafford Smith, and so many other families, Kobe Heisler, Jacob Blake's family, so many other families that have led up to George Floyd and that have lost loved ones after George Floyd. I want the world to know that there is a group of families that are fighting together, that is standing up for justice, that is standing up in solidarity. And we ask that those voices be paid attention to. We ask that those voices that you do not hear about, those stories that have been swept under the rug, that people have not heard, we ask that you hear those voices. Because they were not successful with covering up George Floyd's murder does not mean that the rest of the murders are not just as important. The rest of the lives are just as important, and we want everyone to hear from those families. So I stand here to fight for those families. We will not back down. We will not be quiet in this time, but we are holding up the rest of the families that have taken the same loss as George Floyd family. We are very thankful for the little bit of crumbs that they did give us today with holding this officer accountable. But just like George Floyd is the face of hundreds of murders around Minnesota that have been covered up, so is Derek Chauvin the face of hundreds of killer cops that are still out here walking around in our communities on the forces still serving. They have brutalized family members. They have brutalized the community, and we need these officers held accountable just like they held Derek Chauvin accountable today. We need the rest of these officers held accountable as well, and we cannot be quiet about that and not hold them accountable like we held Derek Chauvin accountable. Thank you. We have Courtney Ross, the girlfriend of George Floyd, here today as well, standing in solidarity with the rest of our families as well.
All right, you've been listening to the Floyd family and their attorneys speak with reporters. The family members described the pain they are feeling over George Floyd's murder. They said they will not celebrate this day, that despite this being a high sentence, that it simply is not enough. Hi, everyone. You're continuing to watch special coverage of the Chauvin sentencing here on CBSN. I'm Elaine Quijano. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to bring in CBS News contributor Ibram X. Kendi joining me now with more. Dr. Kendi, thank you so much for being with us. What is your take on today's sentencing? It was 22 and a half years, not the maximum 30 years. What kind of message do you think that sentence sends?
I think it is important. Yes, sorry about that. I do think it is important to put this sentence, in a larger context. I believe since 2005, 11 officers have been convicted and ultimately sentenced for police violence, and and so it's rare for an officer to be sentenced. Let alone, convicted, but sentenced for this long. And so I think legal observers and people who, of course, have been following police violence cases for some time expected a term or a sentence around this amount. But I can understand, people who live in communities who know people who have been killed by police, who even know people, as some of the family members and activists stated, who are imprisoned with longer sentences for nonviolent, crimes, who aren't going to be satisfied, with this sentence.
And I wonder how you think this trial of Derek Chauvin and this sentencing will impact future cases across the nation, including the upcoming trials for the other officers involved in George Floyd's murder.
I think it's certainly the case that this should hopefully begin a period of accountability, a period in which it's no longer, in which police officers can no longer engage in wanton violence, against citizens, particularly Black and brown citizens, and imagine that they're going to get away with it. And I think that's one of the reasons why this specific case, and watching the video of Derek Chauvin sort of kneeling on George Floyd for more than 9 minutes in broad daylight in front of many witnesses really captured people, because I think for many people, it demonstrated how for some officers, they think they can just do anything to people and get away with it. And so I think, certainly many people are hoping that this is the sort of dawning of accountability for police officers.
I'm curious, Dr. Kendi, what went through your mind when we heard from Derek Chauvin himself? He began his brief statement offering condolences, but went on to essentially hint at some more information to come for the Floyd family. What was your take on that?
So I think it was really hard for me to hear that. And I was really sort of disappointed and even aggrieved. And I think in many ways, Derek Chauvin, should have taken the time to not just express his condolences, to show his condolences. And I think many people were looking for that, and he simply didn't do it.
I wonder, for people who are watching, what kind of broader effect could today's sentencing have, both on the immediate community and the push to end police brutality and systemic racism, but also for so many in the Black community in particular who have felt this sense of trauma at seeing these kinds of videos over and over and over again?
Well, I can speak personally, as someone who, when I'm driving or when I get pulled over by the police or I'm walking by the police, one of the fears is not just potentially being brutalized, not just potentially being killed, but also then being demonized, even though I'm the one who died. And then that officer remaining on the force to brutalize, other people. And so I think that, people who may feel the same way, as I do, have some of the same experiences, some of the same thoughts, certainly it is so rare to see police officers held accountable. And so, that certainly, is a good thing. But I think many people, and I think the George Floyd's family spoke to this, what people are really looking for is for it to not be the case that 3 people almost every day are killed by the police, and then it's rare for those police to be charged, rare for those police to be convicted, and even rare for them to be sentenced for this long.
Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. Dr. Kendi, I know it's been a very difficult day. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your perspective with us. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Let's turn to our legal panel now. Jody Armour, Jessica Levinson, and Keir Dougal. Jody is a law professor at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law. Jessica is a CBS News legal contributor and professor at Loyola Law School. And Keir is a CBS News legal contributor and former federal prosecutor. Welcome to you all. Jody, I'd like to start with you. What's your take on today's sentence and the victim impact statements that we heard?
Well, as someone who's been involved with decarceration and trying to do something about the new Jim Crow, the kind of racialized mass incarceration that's grown up over the last 20, 30 years, we've been making real strides in getting people to stop thinking about blame and punishment in terms of retribution, retaliation, and revenge, which gets us these long sentence enhancements. We hand out life sentences like no other country just about in the world. So we've made progress in moving toward restoration, redemption, and rehabilitation. But it seems that today we're celebrating longer sentences. They longer sentence. We're literally saying, the longer the better. Many are even saying, this isn't long enough. And we're going to keep him, by the way, 23 hours out of 24 hours in a cell in solitary confinement, something that Amnesty International has called torture. And we're going to, kind of feel good about, kind of feeding our retributive urge and our punitive impulses. So I feel a sense of, kind of cognitive dissonance, real ambivalence now. I want police accountability, and certainly he is going to be held accountable, but I also don't want to feed a moral framework that at the end of the day does more harm to blacks than non-blacks, because blacks disproportionately bear the brunt of the criminal justice system.
Jessica, let me turn to you. I want to ask about Judge Cahill. What did you make of how he laid out his reasoning for the sentence?
I think, and listening to your conversation with Jody, it reiterates my feeling that everybody understood this case was asked to bear so much more weight than just one case. And Judge Cahill was so aware of that when he gave out this sentence. There are judges throughout the country every hour giving out very serious criminal sentences. But he knew that this was different, that you and I would be talking about this. And it seemed to me in a lot of ways a very defensive discussion, where he said, it's not about this, it's not about this, but here's what it is about. It's about the law. Please don't ask this particular case to bear more weight than any case can. This can't be the case where we try to solve systemic racism in our criminal justice system. And he laid out his findings in detail in that 22-page ruling. And this is what I think he really realized. He had a lot of different audiences here. This is a legal proceeding. He had to say, I'm looking at the framework that's given to me. I have 12.5 years of a presumptive sentence for second-degree murder for a first offender. And then I have these aggravating factors. So there's a fairly narrow audience. And then he's so cognizant of the fact that there's a much broader audience where he is explaining, in part, the criminal justice system, what this case can and can't do. And I think he knew, and the defense attorney said this, basically, you are never going to make everybody happy. And I think he was very much aware of that as well.
Yeah, Keir, I'm curious about what you thought of the decision to have the mother of Derek Chauvin give a statement as well, whether you think that played into the judge's final decision at all on the sentence, and also more broadly, what kind of precedent do you think this particular sentence sets?
Yeah, in my experience, the family members of the defendant or the defendant himself calling back to his family and the harshness of the impact of a long sentence will have on the family. In the sentencing proceedings that I've been in, that has just not been terribly effective. As you're sitting there, you think, well, none of that would have happened if the defendant hadn't committed the crime that they chose, their acts that they chose to take led to. But the larger question that we've been discussing all afternoon is the sort of what happens next. Where are we going with this? Where can we see reform? And I do want to mention that Attorney General Garland announced a Civil Rights Division pattern and practice investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department. And that is a vehicle that I am hopeful may identify specifically for Minneapolis ways that they can improve policing going forward. Those investigations have resulted in consent decrees in the past for various cities and have helped to make changes that have been salutary, that have been good, that have helped to reduce some of the injustice that we've seen. I hope that this civil rights investigation, pattern and practice investigation, is thorough and comes up with some constructive solutions for the Minneapolis in particular, but maybe for the rest of the country as well. Jody, I want to pick up on what Keir was just saying. I wonder what your thoughts are on that, on the
role that the federal government should play when it comes to changing the way different municipalities, police departments actually conduct their work. Do you think, are you heartened to see this kind of stepping up when it comes to Minneapolis? Do you think this is something that needs to happen more broadly as we look at this issue of police reform in this country?
Certainly it can be part of a broader solution, but it's no panacea. You know, it's far from an end in itself. We've had out here in LA, for example, after the Rampart scandal, there was a DOJ consent decree with LAPD, and we still have had a lot of problems. The sheriff's department out here as well, right next door, didn't necessarily learn any lessons from the DOJ intervention in the LAPD matter. So what we're, finding is that what many of the activists said may be where we need to start going, and that is unbundling the police. I belong to a group called Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is current and former chiefs of police, lieutenants, captains, all the way down to rank and file, who are saying maybe we have been saddled with too many responsibilities. We're not street-level social workers. We shouldn't be out here solving the problem of homelessness, right? We perhaps shouldn't even be in traffic stops to pulling people over for having fragrances hanging from their rearview mirrors. This happened with Dante Wright. While the trial was going on, he was killed behind a kind of pretextual stop along those lines, or tags on his car, still saying pretextual concerns. So maybe unbundling the opportunities when police come into contact with members of stereotyped communities against whom there's a history of violence, possibly a lot of it unconscious, from unconscious biases and mental reflexes, but then, giving our, police of something to focus on, like all communities want violent crime solved. The clearance rate in rape and some other violence crimes is sometimes below 20% for rape, below 40% for homicide. And so focusing police energies in those directions rather than cracking down on communities for broken windows violations and that kind of thing may make us all safer and build more trust and confidence in the police.
Well, Jessica, back on the Derek Chauvin sentencing, do you see the sentencing as having any impact on the trial of the other 3 officers who were present on the day of George Floyd's murder?
I think it does, both in concrete ways and then in more kind of amorphous ways. One, when the verdict came out, that already has to have an impact on the other officers because they're realizing that there is a jury who's looking at the conduct that they were standing right next to and saying, this rises to the level of second-degree murder in Minneapolis. That's not saying that this means they're certainly going to get a conviction, but it shows that there is a jury out there who said, again, the conduct where they were just feet away, it was their colleague, and they arguably had the ability to say, okay, enough. What is the point in this? You need to stop this. That they did nothing, and that there was a conviction, again, for that crime. And in fact, 3 different counts. Then when it comes to the sentencing, I again think it's not good news for the other officers because I know that there's a lot of sentiment out there. Well, for nonviolent drug abusers, there are higher sentences. If you look just at the particulars of the sentencing guidelines in this case, where you have the presumptive 12.5 years, you have the absolute maximum 40 years, you have the case law giving you basically the precedent, the guidance that practically speaking 30 is the boundary, which is why you have the prosecutors asking for 30. And you get something a lot closer to 30 than 12.5, and you get 2 aggravating factors here. That Chauvin acted with cruelty and that he abused his trust and authority. That idea that these officers were standing right next to their colleague while he was acting with such cruelty, while he was abusing his trust, which let's remember, they're also members of the police department. They have the same duty of care. They have the same trust. They have the same duties of trust. That has to feel like bad news for them.
Well, Keir, I do want to get your thoughts on essentially the same question I asked Dr. Kendi a moment ago about what we heard from Derek Chauvin in that brief statement that he made in court today. He said, I do want to give my condolences to the Floyd family. And then he went on to say there's going to be some other information in the future that would be of interest. And I hope things will give you some peace of mind. There was no further explanation. Keir, what did you make of that? And does that suggest to you perhaps some an appeal here from Chauvin's defense attorneys?
Well, I certainly think there'll be an appeal. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I'm glad that he expressed his condolences. I think that represents the bare minimum of decency. On the remark about maybe some information, the teaser, maybe there's some more information coming. I said earlier that I was unsettled by that. I do not think that was effective. I mean, look, he chose to limit his statement because of this other pending proceeding. He's, I'm sure, well aware, is well advised by his lawyer that anything he said could be used against him in the federal proceeding, but that's a choice that he made. If he has some information that he thinks is truly compelling, he doesn't have to assert his Fifth Amendment right. He could effectively preserve his position for a future trial. If he has something that's of critical importance, he's got an opportunity to say it in a way where he can, sort of stand behind whatever information he wants to give instead of teasing something that is, speculative, hard to understand. The entire presentation at the emotional level, where he started off pleading not guilty. His mother said that he was, innocent, claimed that he was innocent. And then to tease there's some information coming in the future in the face of a unanimous jury verdict of the top count. It's dissonant. I thought it was disturbing, and it was unsettling, and ultimately not effective.
Jody, more broadly here, taking a step back, what comes next in the fight against police brutality?
Well, the definition of the problem. You have many people defining the problem as just bad apples and more training and, the kinds of things they already had in place in Minneapolis, right? Minnesota, body cams and implicit bias training, de-escalation training, community policing. And we found that we keep waking up to this racial injustice Groundhog Day, notwithstanding all of those interventions. So the question is, are there some other interventions that will be more effective? And that's where these kind of unbundling the police ideas, minimizing the unnecessary contacts between police and members of these communities, doesn't mean abolishing the police, but focusing them on the kinds of things the communities want solved, filing crime, giving them the investigative skills and resources to go after that and not waste resources chasing turnstile jumpers and enforcing broken windows policing. So I think we're at that crossroads where we have to decide which one of those approaches we're going to take to safety going forward.
A discussion that is going to continue. Jody Armour, Jessica Levinson, and Keir Dugo, good to have you all. Thank you very much. We are going to take a short break, but now is a good time to remind you can stay up to date by downloading our CBS News app. Stay with us. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.
It's a good time for people like us. Everything's starting up.
This is not just another streaming app.
You might want to hold on to something.
This is a mountain of original, bingeable entertainment.
It's just the beginning. The world is now a blank page.
That's why we're here, to save each other.
This is chilling, unsettling, and brilliantly bonkers. Oh, This is weird and hilarious, stylish and cheeky.
I imagine she dreams of casting me aside like an old shoe.
Oh, honey, you know I'd never throw away a shoe.
This is a joy to watch, a wonder to explore, and a peak TV experience.
We are such stuff as dreams are made of.
I'm so happy! Yay! Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Football, soccer, whatever you want to call it, it's huge. It's the best and biggest competition.
You have a golden opportunity now or never.
Oh, yes!
Oh, they did it!
Unbelievable!
It's not over yet.
The UEFA Champions League. Stream every match live on Paramount Plus.
Let's get this party started.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is Paramount Plus. This is strokes of genius, beautiful games, and one shining moment. This is Defenders, Investigators, and
7 strangers picked to live in a house.
This is young SpongeBob, young Sheldon, and younger. This is everything you've been looking for.
That's gonna leave a mark.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment.
All right.
This is Paramount Plus, now streaming.
Whose stories are worth telling? Who's worth hearing? Never let anyone decide that for you.
This is not just another streaming app. This is love taps, death traps, and whip snaps. Oh, this is things that go boom and things that go boom. This is justice. This is fearless.
This is business.
This is all the drama you can handle.
You must go. Make your stand.
Live sports, breaking news, and a mountain of entertainment. Paramount Plus, now streaming.